Good evening and welcome to Clackamas County Planning Commission meeting here on July 26, 2021. The public hearing is now open for consideration of ZDO 280 legislative.
Murph, hang on, sorry. Let's do the roll first, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, Darcy, roll.
Commissioner Moss?
Here.
Commissioner Murphy?
Present.
Commissioner Lopes?
Here.
Commissioner Pack is not present. Commissioner Wilson?
Present.
Commissioner Schrodel is not here. Commissioner Peterson? I got a message from him. He will be joining us momentarily. Commissioner Pasco
Present.
and Commissioner Stevens is absent.
Perfect. So it looks like we do have 4 people in the audience. Is everybody in, Darcy, that wants to be in? You've brought everybody over. We're all fully open, right?
When it's time for public testimony, then I will bring them over.
Right. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure the audience is all in at this point. Anybody who was waiting. Okay, perfect. All right, Murph, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay. Again, welcome to the Planning Commission on Monday night here, July 26th, 2021. The public hearing is now open for consideration of ZDO 280, a legislative proposal to amend the Clackamas County Comprehensive Plan and Zoning Development Ordinance. Assisting us with the hearing are several members of the county staff: Planning Director Jennifer Hughes, Senior Planner Glenn Hamburg, and Administrative Specialist Darcy Renhart. The public hearing is being conducted virtually using the Zoom platform. Panelists for today's hearing which include members of the Planning Commission, county staff, have both audio and visual capability. If the panelist is participating with audio but not video, members of our audience will not see that panelist's name on their screen, but will be able to hear them when they speak. Audience members who have joined the meeting will have their mics muted unless they wish to testify, in which case they will be called upon to do so by the county staff moderator. Audience members, video will not be turned on at any time. Today's hearing will be recorded as required by law. The county will make every effort to post the recording on the county's website as soon as possible. We have a general statement. The Planning Commission is charged with making recommendations on the application to the Board of County Commissioners. The record for the hearing will be forwarded to the board, which will make the final decision on this matter. The board will conduct another hearing on this application on August 18th, 9:30 a.m. The hearing will be de novo, meaning that the hearing will start anew and additional testimony may be offered. Tonight's hearing will not go beyond 10 p.m. If not concluded, it will be continued to a date and time certain. The hearing will be continued for other reasons as well. If an announcement of an additional hearing date and time is made tonight, it will be the only notice given that the additional hearing. The public hearing will be conducted as follows. Planning and zoning staff report. Number 2, enter into the record of any additional correspondence received. 3, technical information from the government agencies. 4, testimony by representatives of recognized community planning organizations or hamlets. Maximum length, 10 minutes per CPO or hamlet. Testimony by other person. Maximum length, 3 minutes per speaker or more if determined by the chair. Closing of the public hearing, Planning Commission discussion and action. Testimony. There is designated time during the hearing when you will be open for testimony. The chair will make it clear when this time is. If you want to provide testimony, you will utilize raise your hand feature in Zoom. Attendees on the PC or iPad, you will have a raise your hand button on the Zoom bar, top or bottom, depending on your device. Attendees on a PC or iPad, you will have raise your hand button on the Zoom bar, top or bottom, depending on your device. Attendees by telephone use *9 to activate the raise your hand feature. When the moderator switches you over to provide testimony, your screen will look different for a moment. Primarily, you will see participants' cameras, not just the one who is speaking. Staff will call upon you when it's time for you to provide your testimony. For the record, please state your name and where you're from and who you're representing when you begin. Once you have provided your testimony, your mic will be muted and your screen will be returned to normal. Staff report, the Planning and Zoning Division staff will now present. Are there any comments from staff or the commission? Okay.
Very good. Thank you, Commissioner. Glenn Hamburg, Senior Planner. I'm going to start by sharing my screen for the PowerPoint slide. Okay. Great. I hope that everybody can see the first title slide of the PowerPoint. Very good. As Commissioner Murphy already introduced, tonight's public hearing is the first of two scheduled public hearings on a package of amendments to the county's comprehensive plan and its zoning and development ordinance. They're being proposed in a package of amendments that we're calling this fiscal year 2021's minor amendments. And we've done a similar package like this previously, just last year in ZDO 276, which was adopted by the Board of County Commissioners in September of last year. And this is this year's package of amendments. The schedule for tonight will start with a brief background on how we got to this proposal, and then lead into a summary of what the proposal actually includes. We're not going to talk about every specific issue in detail, but I'm going to try to make sure that it's clear everything that the package will address, and then pull out some significant issues that may be worth some discussion. To be sure, though, the proposed significant issues are just those that staff has identified might be worth some further discussion, and the Planning Commission could look to discuss any of the other issues in this package as well. Ultimately, tonight, staff will give its recommendation, and that recommendation being based on findings of the proposal's consistency with things like statewide planning goals, relevant statutes, and code provisions for amendments to the comprehensive plan and the zoning code. But first, on that background, why we're doing this is because this task, this project, to do amendments to the county's comprehensive plan and zoning development ordinance are a project that's in the county's adopted long-range planning work program. That's attachment B in the record. And you'll see in that work plan that we have committed to making certain time-sensitive and other amendments that maybe warrant little in the way of staff research, but are necessary to comply with new legislation, or to correct errors, or to address other priorities of the Planning Commission or the Board of County Commissioners that, like I say, take maybe less staff time and simply could be folded into a project with others. We already had a study session with the Planning Commission back in April, you might remember, where we discussed some of the topics that this package would address, and we solicited some input from the Planning Commission on exactly what the scope of those amendments should be, and that is informing a lot of what we're proposing here tonight. We also had a policy session with the Board of County Commissioners in May where we did the same. We introduced to the board what topics we'd like to address in this package, solicited their input, and then used that input to inform the actual text amendments that we're proposing and discussing here tonight. In addition to that, we've had community input. These ideas aren't all ideas of the staff or indeed of the Planning Commission or the board, but are the result of specific input for members of the community. And some of that input is expressed in the public comments that are in the record, and I'm happy to talk about further tonight. Ultimately, there are what staff has described as 12 proposed general actions in this package. Of course, there's many specific types of things this package of amendments is proposing to do, but for discussion purposes, we've grouped them into these 12 actions that I'm going to list here for you first. The festive colors on the slide are meant for some designation of what will ultimately be topics that are identified as significant issues here tonight that staff have already prepared to pull out and discuss in more detail before talking about any recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. The green listed items are those that staff have not identified as significant issues needing more discussion tonight, but we certainly can discuss that if the Planning Commission desires. The first of the 12 proposed actions are a proposed expansion to the allowances for metal as an exterior building material in all areas of the county. And we're going to talk about this in some more detail here in a few slides, but you might recall from our study session back in April that right now the zoning code doesn't expressly allow the use of metal as an exterior building material in certain kinds of new development. And in this action, we're only really talking about new institutional development, new commercial, industrial, or multifamily developments, or developments of more than one two-family or three-family dwelling on the same property. So developments that have more than one duplex or triplex. In this discussion of exterior building materials, we're not talking about detached single-family dwellings, pole barns out in rural areas that are accessory structures. We're only talking about these. And right now, it's the case that you may not necessarily be allowed to use metal or certain kinds of metal as an exterior building material. And the Planning Commission recommended, as did the Board of County Commissioners in its earlier meetings, to propose in this package allowing the use of metal as an exterior building material in these kinds of new development without any qualifiers, and indeed allowing the use of exterior building materials that are even intentionally rusted or corroded, provided that they are treated to prevent further rust or corrosion. More on that here in a few slides. Back in April, the Planning Commission unanimously recommended that this package proposed to repeal the county's own limitations on property line adjustments and natural resource zones. The Board of County Commissioners agreed, and that's what we're proposing in this package today. Not proposing any further discussion on that topic since everybody has agreed to it so far, but we can certainly talk about it. This package proposes to allow additional signs for commercial drive-through businesses. This is another one of those topics that the Planning Commission talked about at some length back in April. This proposal is to amend the zoning code to make it clear that commercial drive-through businesses can have additional signage in their approved drive-through lanes. That is in addition to the signage that they're already allowed just as any other commercial business. The standards and criteria for that commercial drive-through signage are those that were recommended by the Planning Commission back in April, and we'll discuss those. The next action is proposed to extend the pre-application conferences validity period from the current 1-year period to 2 years. We'll talk about that in a few slides. The package proposes to allow government offices as conditional uses in all urban residential zones. If you remember from the April study session, standalone government offices are not allowed in certain urban residential zones, despite that land use being potentially allowable as a conditional use in basically other zones. We're talking about government offices that are not ancillary to or accessory to some other permitted governmental use on the same property, but just their own standalone governmental office. The Planning Commission's recommendation back in April was to allow this use as a conditional use in all urban residential zones, not just some of them and not just in other areas of the county. Another action proposed in this package is something that we have not yet talked about with the Planning Commission, and was proposed to be included in this package after the study session in April. So staff have selected that out as one issue that could be worth some discussion tonight. That issue, action number 6, is to allow charitable healthcare services accessory to places of worship. So those would be churches, mosques, synagogues. Indeed, the proposal is to clarify that healthcare services are an acceptable accessory use for an approved place of worship. And more on that here in a little bit. Another action proposed in this package is to modify the approval periods or the implementation periods for approved places of worship to match those timeframes of approved hospitals and other public facilities. This is another topic that is being added to the package now after the study session in April. So something to talk about this evening. The remaining actions may not warrant any further discussion tonight before the Planning Commission makes a recommendation to the board. But just in brief, those other actions proposed in this package are to establish and clarify some rules for time extensions. There's some vague aspects in the zoning code right now about the rules for time extensions on approved land use permits. The proposal in this package is to clarify some of those ambiguities. We also propose to clarify some of the rules for modifications to approved land use permits, things like clarifying the validity period for that modification approval. Another action is to identify that certain dog-related commercial activities, boarding, daycare, grooming, are already allowed in the C2 zoning district. That's the community commercial zoning district. There's some of that zoning in the downtown Oak Grove area. We're not proposing to add any new use that's not already allowed. There has already been a formal land use decision that has interpreted the county zoning code to already allow those uses. We're just looking to codify it in the code so that anybody that turns to the list of allowed uses in this zone would see this and not just have to know that it's allowed. This package proposes to also recognize that certain allowances, that there are already certain allowances for sewer components and the provision of sewer services outside of urban growth boundaries according to state law. So state law already allows things like sewer facilities to cross through areas that are outside of an urban growth boundary under certain criteria. We want to make sure that that's clear in both the comprehensive plan and the zoning and development ordinance. So there's some amendments proposed in this package. Finally, there's just sort of a grab bag of other minor, non-substantive, what we sometimes call housekeeping changes to the ZDO that are proposed in this package. These would be things like clarifying some of the processes for property line adjustments and replats. They're all detailed though in the staff report that was sent out about a week ago. Maybe before I move on, I could check in with Commissioner Murphy and ask the group whether beyond these significant issues that I've pulled out, whether there's any other issue that the Planning Commission hopes to discuss tonight.
Commissioners, do you have anything to add?
Hearing,
I get-
great. Well, I'm certainly happy to talk about any of these other issues if it comes up, but I'm going to start with these 5 significant issues. So the discussion of the use of metal as an exterior building material, commercial drive-through signs, the pre-application conference validity period, healthcare services, accessory to places of worship, and finally, the place of worship approval period issue. Starting though with the metal as an exterior building material. There's a lot of text on this slide, and I apologize. But what I'm hoping to do here is to present a specific question. And if the Planning Commission agrees, that might help to sort of package ultimately a motion to the Board of County Commissioners. But before I read through this slide, I'll just sort of, again, explain what the proposal in the draft amendments would be. The proposal is to expressly allow the use of metal as an exterior building material for these kinds of new development: institutional, commercial, industrial, multifamily, and 2 or more duplexes or triplexes in all areas of the county, regardless of the type of metal. So we would not be saying only these types of metal are allowed and not these. And under the proposal, the use of metal would be allowed in all areas of the county, including in the Fuller Road Station community or up in the government camp area, where at least in the past, there have been specific design standards that have sometimes precluded the use of metal. For example, up in the government camp area, there has been a prohibition on the use of corrugated metal roofing in the MRR district of the government camp area. The proposal is to repeal that limitation. Importantly, there are still other design standards that new developments such as these would still have to meet. So for example, even under the proposal, new development in the MRR district of the Mount Hood area would still have to demonstrate that it is in line with some of the other intentional design goals of the government camp area. Things like having development that is in a Cascadian style or kind of that national park motif. So even if somebody was proposing a development that included corrugated metal roofing, they would still need to show how their entire design is consistent with those design goals. On the topic of rusting or corrosion, well, the Planning Commission explored back in April how in some new development, it is an intentional design goal to have rusting or corrosion, just like shown in this picture. So under this proposal, we would say that that is allowed. A developer can use intentionally rusted or corroded metal as part of their exterior building material design, but it has to be coated in such a way to inhibit additional future rust or corrosion. Similarly, surfaces that don't have that intentional rusting or corrosion also have to be coated to prohibit additional rusting or corrosion. So the question I'm putting forth to the Planning Commission is, should we move forward with this concept as drafted? Significant issue number 1 reads, should metal be expressly allowed as an exterior building material for those types of development in all areas of the county, provided there are those treatments, that coating that I just mentioned? Some pros on the one side might be that, well, metal is an increasingly common design element. Developers have requested it. Indeed, one of the exhibits that was just sent this afternoon and came out or came into the record earlier today was from a developer, AKS Engineering, that's in favor of this amendment. We've heard from no party in writing that they are against this amendment. And allowing more types of building materials to be used could make it easier for developers. It's also the case that the existing language in the code that only allows metal if it's found to be quote unquote high image has been quite ambiguous, both to the public and to staff who have to implement it. Adding some clarity into the code saying it is just expressly allowed could remove some of that ambiguity. On the other hand, there may be downsides to allowing just metal outright without additional sidebars on it. Some concerns that have been discussed in the past are things like the metal in industrial areas in low sections of a building may be more prone to denting. You know, if the lower sections of a metal building in an industrial area aren't, for example, protected with stone or some other type of exterior building material, they may get backed into by cars and dented, and that might look unsightly. Some other concerns that might be worth keeping in mind are that, well, different areas of the county have just developed different aesthetics, and allowing the use of metal in more new development in those areas may disrupt the existing design aesthetic. But maybe before moving on to the next issue, we could have some discussion about this if there is any.
So just one clarification. I think this would be appropriate if you have questions for Glenn, but we wouldn't want any deliberation until after you've taken testimony.
Thank you.
I have a question right off the bat. Is there any time frame for the type of finish? Any kind of guarantee that you're requiring on the finish? Currently, if you buy a powder coated metal for architectural use, such as a roof, it comes with, now they're offering 40-year corrosion proof covers on it. So I'm wondering if there's going to be a requirement on that type of protection for the metal. My second question would be, working with metals going to require ventilation behind it because it conducts moisture just like a windshield does. So when you have a hot on the outside or a cold and an area that it's enclosing and it's producing humidity, it will condense. So it has to have some kind of ventilation to keep it dry also. Just a couple points I'd like to bring forward.
Thank you. On the first question, no, there's nothing in the proposal that relates to any specific time frame for the coating that prevents unintended rust or corrosion. It would simply be the case under the current proposed wording of the amendments that if you're going to use metal, you have to coat it to prevent unintended rust or corrosion. And if the coating that you use only is good for 20 years, well, presuming the rules don't change of the zoning code, you're going to have to refresh that coating in 20 years. Okay. Any other questions about significant issue number one?
I have a question.
Sure.
On your write-up there, it says, and multifamily developments and for developments of more than 1, 2, or 3 family dwellings. What's the difference in multifamily developments and those other 1, 2, or 3 family dwellings?
Practically speaking, very little. Although a multifamily dwelling would just be one structure of more than 3 dwelling units in it. So more than 3 apartments. Whereas a 2-family dwelling is just one structure with only 2 dwelling units in it. It's a duplex. A 3-family dwelling is one single structure of only 3 dwelling units. And then it's a multifamily dwelling after that. So these existing restrictions on metal as an exterior building material have not applied to an individual duplex on a property, but would apply to developments of, say, 2 separate buildings, 2 separate duplexes on the same property, or triplexes.
So you could have 2 buildings on the same property and both of them could be metal or not?
Under this proposal, yes.
It just seemed a little additional wordiness in there to me, but that's just me. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll move forward to the next issue, and then if there are questions about metal that pop up, I'm happy to go back. The other issue is about that signage for commercial drive-throughs. And again, the context here is that right now the zoning code doesn't really give drive-through businesses an allowance for additional signs, despite commercial drive-throughs typically needing more in what are technically signs, things like menu boards in the drive-through lanes. Another important fact that we mentioned back in April is that we can't regulate signs according to content, which just makes things a little bit tricky in that, for example, we couldn't allow a drive-through business to have additional signage that are for menu items, because we can't regulate what the signs themselves say. We just have to get a little bit more creative. So when we talked about this back in April, the Planning Commission recommended that we have an allowance for drive-through signs in addition to the signage that a commercial business is already allowed in the zoning code. So things like signs on their building or a freestanding sign in their parking lot. In addition to that, drive-through businesses can have an unlimited number of signs for drive-through customers that are no taller than 8 feet and that are oriented towards drive-through lanes. The intention with these, as staff understands it, are to prohibit drive-through signs from being used to advertise to customers off-site, and essentially give drive-through businesses more of a sign allowance than other commercial businesses with regard to advertising to off-site customers. So as long as the drive-through signs are really only oriented towards those driving through the drive-through lanes and are of a height that is clearly for that use, the zoning code under this proposal wouldn't limit, for example, the number of drive-through signs that an approved drive-through business could have, or necessarily the size of any particular sign, provided, of course, it's not taller than 8 feet. So some upsides to the proposal are that providing the allowance in the code would give clarity to staff and some certainty to drive-through commercial businesses that what signs they are already putting up in their drive-through lane are allowed. There's the additional protection already in the zoning code for some consideration of the drive-through signs, because new commercial development requires design review approval from the county. And in that design review approval, staff can evaluate the proposed drive-through signs. For example, these screens that are proposed in these pictures. And staff can make a determination of, are they taller than 8 feet? And are they oriented towards a drive-through lane before that sign is actually constructed? So there's some sort of check and balance on the regulation. Some downsides, though, are that, well, as I mentioned, there's no proposed limits on the number of drive-through signs that a drive-through business can have, provided they're no taller than 8 feet and are oriented towards drive-through lanes. So if the Planning Commission is concerned that too much signage could look unsightly, even if it's just in a drive-through lane, the Planning Commission could recommend some limitation on the amount of drive-through signage. I'll stop there and maybe just ask if there's any questions about this issue.
I have one, Glenn. of course.
Okay,
This isn't just restricted to food businesses, right? It could be a pharmacy, it could be a bank.
correct,
Okay, it could be any business that offers drive-through.
correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other commissioners have questions? Okay,
I should have said on the previous issue that should this metal be allowed as proposed, staff's recommendation, as I'll highlight at the end, is yes, it should be allowed, metal as an exterior building material with these restrictions. And then same with the drive-throughs issue. Staff's recommendation is yes, the code should be amended to allow additional signs for commercial drive-through businesses, provided they're not taller than 8 feet and they're oriented towards drive-through lanes. The next significant issue is about those pre-application conferences and their validity period. Recall from April that before somebody can make an application for certain types of new development, things like a zone change or a subdivision or a partition or design review, these more potentially complex proposals, before somebody can walk in and turn in an application for that type of new development, they must have a pre-application conference. And at that pre-app, they meet with the senior planner, typically, who is in charge of that type of land use application, and other interested representatives of other interested agencies. That might be somebody, for example, from the survey office, if the proposal is going to be a subdivision, or maybe somebody from the local water and sewer service district. Everybody sort of meets around the table with a prospective applicant to give them some project-specific guidance, raise some red flags, talk to them about the permit application process, and sort of give them some guidance on how things might be modified so that their proposal, once they submit it, could be approved. These meetings are beneficial both for the prospective applicant and for staff. For the applicant, it means that they're getting some project-specific guidance and are being told, oh, this won't work, or you're going to need to change this about your plans in order for it to be approved. It also means that we get higher quality applications when they're ultimately turned in, and that creates some more efficiency for staff. But right now, those pre-apps are only good for 1 year, meaning that if you have your pre-application conference tomorrow, you have to turn in the actual application for that prospective development within 12 months of tomorrow. What we found in the last year and a half, and maybe even before that, is that those 12 months can go by really quickly, especially if the proposed development has a lot of changes that need to be made, or is just otherwise pretty complex. It takes time to put together the formal plans and to address all of the potential approval criteria. It's particularly challenging when you're in a pandemic, when there's wildfires, when there are ice storms. We've just noticed that these things that are happening out in the world are influencing people's ability to meet these certain deadlines. There are other jurisdictions that have pre-application conferences. Indeed, they're pretty common. Other jurisdictions, though, have pre-application conference validity periods that are longer than Clackamas counties. In the city of Portland and the city of Milwaukee, for example, the pre-apps are good for 2 years, not just 1 year. In the city of Gladstone, there is no expiration date. It's my understanding that the planner sort of makes the call of whether or not a previous pre-app is still good or whether or not somebody needs to have another one. Staff's recommendation is to continue to have a validity period for the pre-app because it serves an important purpose. The validity period helps to ensure that prospective applicants are hearing about the most recent regulations. If we didn't have a pre-application conference validity period, maybe somebody has a pre-app, but then the relevant rules change. And 3 years later, they come in with their application and it's based on the previous rules. So it kind of helps keep people up to speed. Staff's recommendation is for it to be extended to 2 years. And that's longer than the 16 or rather 18 months that the Planning Commission suggested that we consider back in April. The main reason for that is having 2 years as opposed to just 18 months for the pre-app validity period is just easier to keep track of. It's just a rounder number, and we do basically everything else in the zoning code according to years. So for example, the validity period for land use decisions are based on years. And if we said 18 months, it adds just that little bit of complexity of, well, what specific day does this expire on? Staff's feeling is it wouldn't make such a difference to extend it 6 more months to be around 2 years and keep it easier for the applicant to know when it expires and easier for staff to calculate as well. In April, the Planning Commission asked us to look into, well, how often has this been coming up as an issue for applicants? Well, there's not a forensic way that we can go about answering that question, but I have polled staff, and we'd estimate that basically in the last year, and this year being somewhat typical, there's about half a dozen times when somebody has wanted to turn in an application only to learn that their pre-app was expired. So half a dozen times maybe in a given year. Sometimes the pre-app has expired just after or just before they actually turn in their application. In other cases, it's already been 3 or 4 months. So staff's proposal is to extend the pre-application conference from 1 year to 2 years. And happy to answer any questions about that issue.
I have a quick question on this one. One of the things, if I remember correctly, we discussed at our work session was this concept of potentially making it permissive to the planning director or the planning department so that you all could choose to waive that deadline, but it wasn't necessarily required. And if I recall right, the concern was, well, if things on the ground change during that period, you know, there are examples when that might take place. Did you guys think about that? And was it kind of dismissed just as too complex and gray area, or give me some thoughts on where you
Thank
were with
you.
that?
Yeah, we did think about it, and staff would prefer to have less power on this issue, at least. That this is not something that staff would want to have to evaluate. It's much easier for us to communicate to the public just a clear black and white expiration date of this is good for this period, and we can apply without having to think about any specific project. We can apply the same time frame to all applicants. A concern that staff might have if we have the authority to issue some applicants an extension and not others is, well, what criteria are we using to make that determination? And is that going to create some controversy? It would be easier for us if we just had a strict rule that applies to everybody.
Kevin?
Thank you, Murph. So Glenn, for my learning interpretation, is this, do all people that have applications, do they all, is this a requirement that they have to go through with this, or could someone just submit an application and then staff would evaluate it and say yay or nay based on our criteria?
Yeah, good question. The answer is no, not all land use applications have to have a pre-app. A lot of the routine applications that our office processes, things like temporary dwelling for care permits, home occupation permits, property line adjustments, they don't require any sort of pre-app. People can choose to pay for a pre-app even on ahead of those land use application types if they want to. I have in the last year done just one optional pre-application conference when it wasn't required, but the pre-app is required for those more complicated types of applications. So again, things like amendments to the zoning map, or land divisions, or design review, or home occupations that are looking for certain exceptions to the normal standards. In those cases, they have to have a pre-app.
And is there like a I know this goes into PGA, but is there a communication plan around that? Because I think that'd be a great thing to share with the public of just kind of black and white. Here's what Clackamas County does, and this is that, just to make it clear, another layer to share with the public.
Yeah, we do our best to communicate that when we're talking to customers. So if somebody, for example, sends us an email and asks us about the permit application process for splitting their property, we try to make sure that they know not just about the application and its fee, but that they have to have this pre-application conference first before they even start that. The need for the pre-app is also listed in the land use application form that requires it. So there shouldn't, at least in theory, be anybody filling out an application for a partition and turning it in, not realizing that they were supposed to have a pre-app. It explains that in the application form and requires some information about the pre-app. But it's definitely something that we really want people to know about before, spending a lot of time on certain land use applications that require the pre-application conference.
Thank you.
Glenn, is there a charge?
Yeah, the current fee is $850.
Oh, yeah, so you show up. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it had been until just a year or so ago, $500, but then at least the last couple of years, I want to say it's been $850. I would venture to say that $850 still does not cover all of the associated costs for the staff time for the people that are there, but it helps.
Can they, 2 years is a long time to remember or lose notes. Can they go back and contact who they had been in contact with?
Yeah, that's not uncommon for people to maybe several months down the line contact the county for a copy of their pre-application conference notes, because it's generally the case that we provide written comments and we keep those on file. They're publicly available. Anybody can ask for them, not just the people who had the pre-app. But indeed, we probably hope that they ask us for those notes, because there's going to be notes on how they should address certain criteria for their application.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Okay. The next issue, this issue and the one that follows it, are those two that we haven't talked about as a group before. The suggestion to include these in the package came after the April meeting. So I'm going to give you some of the context for them and then also explain what the amendments are. But while they're addressed in the staff report, it might be helpful to answer some questions that you have about these, or to just sort of unpack what all it would do. So right now, the zoning code requires a conditional use permit for places of worship in basically all areas of the county. And a place of worship being things like, again, a church, a synagogue, etc. And the zoning code does already allow certain uses that are customarily accessory to that permitted use. And the list of allowed accessory uses has some things that you kind of would expect. It says things like you can have a satellite dish. So if you get an approved church building, the zoning code says you could have a satellite dish on it. It's something that's accessory to that use, and you just have it. The list of allowed accessory uses is not an exhaustive list. It's a list that gives some examples and implies that there are other accessory uses that are also allowed already under the zoning code. State law also already requires the county to allow places of worship to also conduct certain other related land uses. So there's a statute, I wrote it down, ORS 215-441. That statute already says that if you have an approved place of worship, you get to do things like conduct weddings, hold funeral services, do those kinds of things that places of worship are often, again, customarily engaged in doing. That list in statute is also not a complete list. It's a list of examples, and it implies that there are others. Under this proposal, the county is proposing to amend the zoning code to clarify that certain charitable healthcare services are an allowed accessory use to a place of worship. And we would do that by amending the zoning code section 804, that lists some criteria for approved places of worship. Through those amendments, we would repeat what state law says are already allowed in an approved place of worship. Again, things like weddings and funeral services. And then we would also say that a charitable healthcare service that occupies no more than 10% of the combined floor area of all of the structures that are associated with that place of worship on the same property, so that it's something that is smaller than the church service, for example, itself, but is something that's clearly smaller in scope than the rest of the land uses occurring on the property. And the use would only be considered allowed if it was operated by a charitable organization that is tax exempt under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. So this amendment is probably the one that members of the public have commented on the most. And I believe we might have forwarded on some of the comments on this proposal that have come in since Saturday morning up until 5 o'clock today. With those comments, there should be a total of 79 total comments that are in the record. And I just noticed in my email yet one more on this topic. Most all of those comments, which now are a total of 80, are about this topic. And of all of those, all of them are in favor of this amendment. We have received no comments in opposition to it. On the one hand, allowing, or rather amending the code to identify this as an allowed accessory use expressly would help to ensure that the zoning code reflects that a use that some places of worship already consider part of their ministry as allowed. And it would respond to some clear community interest. Interestingly, though, where places of worship are allowed already as a conditional use in what we call our exception lands, our rural residential lands, or our rural commercial lands, or rural industrial lands. There's already an opportunity to get a conditional use permit for a place of worship. And there is not in all of these zones an allowance for just healthcare services in general. You can't, for example, in the rural residential farm forest 5-acre district, that kind of rural residential zone, RFF5, get a conditional use permit for a hospital. You can get a conditional use permit for a place of worship, but not for a hospital. If we were to adopt this amendment, there would be this situation where healthcare services could be allowed in these areas, but only if they are conducted as a use accessory to a place of worship. So that's something to consider. But we're not proposing really to add any specific new use necessarily. We're not proposing to allow healthcare services generally in rural residential or other areas, because this project is about these minor and time-sensitive amendments with little staff analysis. And going down that road is just bigger than this project is intended for. What this would do is clarify that under the zoning code, healthcare services, when they're of this scope, no more than 10% of the floor area, and it's conducted as a charitable operation on the same property as an approved place of worship, that it's an allowed use. I think that there could be questions about this, so maybe I'll just stop there and ask if there are.
I think Kevin and I both have our hands up. Who wants to go first?
And maybe I could give Jennifer the opportunity to clarify anything if she would like to. There is a related change to the staff recommendation that maybe I should just highlight really quickly, is that there's these concepts of urban and rural reserves. These are urban areas, urban reserves. You can think of them as areas that are sort of on deck to being brought into a UGB when it's necessary. Rural reserves are sort of the opposite. They're areas that are kind of out of bounds and are not brought into a UGB. There are these regulations out there that address allowances for new uses in urban and rural reserves. And we have a policy in our comprehensive plan that also speaks to allowing new land uses in these reserves. Staff's recommendation will be, when we get to that in that slide, is that we make one more amendment to the comprehensive plan, and I'll cite the specific policy later, but to clarify that this land use would be allowed in urban and rural reserves as well. Because again, the idea is that this is not necessarily a new land use, but rather a clarification that this accessory use can be allowed. So now with that, I can answer some questions.
Kevin, why don't you go first?
Coming from, because I don't think it's with I don't view this within our scope of the planning commission to tell churches, synagogues, wherever, how much space a charitable organization can use on things. I think it should be up to the place of worship to decide how much space to give them, and we don't have anything to do with that. And so can you explain that one to me?
Sure. The 10% number is somewhat arbitrary. There's nothing magic about 10% versus 9% or 11%. But the 10% number is something that helps demonstrate that the use is accessory and that the use isn't a primary use. It helps to show that the use isn't, for example, a hospital that would otherwise not be allowed, but rather just something that is accessory to a larger operation, a larger place of worship. So that's how we got to the 10%. We proposed the 10% to some representatives of the Borland Free Clinic and the Rolling Hills Community Church, a property owner who is interested in this topic, and basically all of the public testimony is centered on. And this amount seems to be workable to them. So for the healthcare services that they want to be able to provide, this is a floor area that would, it sounds like, work for them.
I'm just foreseeing issues in my mind of there's a clinic somewhere or something at a church and someone's gonna say, well, you're occupying more space than you should be allowed. I just think that's an area I'd rather the county stay out of. But that's where I'm at for now.
Brian? Commissioner Casco?
Couple questions. I guess my first question, Glenn, is I'm wondering, is there a definition for healthcare services in our code anywhere? So,
No, I don't believe there is.
So that just there's one concern in the back of my mind, which is on the whole, I think this is a great proposal, right? I think across the country, we've seen that clinics and churches are really important for serving low-income people, people in need. They're generally a very good thing. We've also seen places in the country where clinics have shown up in places of worship that don't have any actual licensed healthcare providers in those clinics, and that the clinics are designed to, in some cases, push a particular agenda. And it comes down to my concern is I would hate for us to be essentially authorizing clinics and places of worship that aren't somehow tied to actual licensed or certified healthcare services. And I don't know if there's a way to incorporate that definition in the code, whether it makes sense for these facilities to be licensed and certified by ODH, or if there's another way to tackle that. But that's just the one concern that's in the back of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Wilson?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Brian. This is a little ambiguous here, and I'm concerned about it that we could have some clinics that want to get started here, and they are giving a service that, well, let me say it like this, is going to create more of a problem for the county than what we're looking to solve here. I agree that a majority of those services, healthcare services that may be provided by a church or some religious organization are probably good, but there's the opportunity here for us to get into some real sticky situations with situations where the healthcare services may be detrimental to the public.
So I maybe want to respond a little bit here to both of the last two questions. I think that you could, because we are specifying in this case, this very particular use is accessory to a church. I think if you wanted to say they have to have licensed healthcare providers in some way, I think we could add that and that would be okay. I do want to be careful to point out though, that as Glenn said, this is still not an exhaustive list. And while there might be certain things that some of us may question, when people are exercising their religious beliefs, I think we do need to be careful about suggesting that we would be limiting the way in which they would do that. So they could come to us regardless and propose a different accessory use. And there would be a process for that where they still could argue that it was accessory. It's just more discretionary. So they're going to need a different type of land use review and all of that. So it wouldn't really be preventing that, but we wouldn't be explicitly defining. And I think there is a line there. And so I think you could, in this case, speak to licensed healthcare providers if that's what you would prefer. I think we may get some testimony also tonight, potentially, and perhaps they might speak to that concern as well.
And if we wanted to use the word qualified, for example, I would be fine with that too. But if we're suggesting to the public that it's a healthcare service, there should be qualified healthcare providers there.
Sure.
That's a reasonable expectation.
Sure. Yes. Point taken. Thank you.
Commissioner Peterson?
Yeah, mine's, maybe it's a topic that's
going to get addressed in the future, but it got me also thinking about churches that provide places for people who are homeless or down on their luck. Or what about churches that maybe provide services for people who have addiction or mental health issues and things like that? Do they fall into the same category, or is that a whole nother area that needs to be addressed as we start talking about how religious organizations can provide various services to the community?
I think that falls into the counseling that was referenced, right?
Right. I think the counseling service would probably cover some of what you're talking about. And, you know, if we went with licensed healthcare providers, I think you would get some behavioral health services there that would be covered. Your point is a good one, though, that there is a broader range of social services that religious institutions are providing or may wish to provide. And this amendment is really very narrow because, again, this was a specific request and we're trying to keep it kind of, you know, from ballooning into a larger project. But I still think, as I mentioned before, under this accessory use provision, there's other things that churches could argue are permitted, you know, within their scope. And I also know that there was some legislation regarding the homeless, the point you had about services to the homeless. There was some legislation last session that got at some allowances for religious institutions, I think more in terms of like shelter or transitional housing. And so we will be looking at that because some of it's mandatory. And so the county will have to implement that. And I think that'll happen on our housing side, that project we're doing for housing. But for the services piece, yes, there's a lot of other things they might want to do. And we were trying to keep this relatively narrow because of the whole minor amendments. You know, we didn't really want scope creep too much. And I maybe just want to comment too, because I don't know if Glenn really, I can't remember exactly if he said this, but just to clarify, this didn't, you know, wasn't presented at your study session, and it's because it was a request that came from the board after. So, you know, they were looking at this with this very specific purpose in mind, the health, medical, you know, the medical services. But yes, there's a lot of other things that are and could be going on with service provision.
So then those are, they're still under consideration, but not necessarily something we're going to address with this particular set of them.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Am I understanding correctly that if we didn't pass this at all, this use would still be likely allowed? It would just, I mean, it's the current statute is broad enough in scope that this would be allowed. What is there something more that's driving this than this particular concern?
We don't know if it's allowed, at least formally. This particular use is not one of those that's explicitly listed in the relevant statute. And it's not listed in that list of examples of customarily accessory uses. We have a formal process that anybody can go through for a formal interpretation of the zoning code. They can make an application for a planning director's interpretation, and they could say, is a healthcare service that occupies this many square feet and provides these types of services, is that a use that is accessory to a place of worship and already allowed under the zoning code? Nobody's ever asked us that question formally, and we've not issued a formal interpretation on it. So the answer is sort of, we don't know if it's allowed because nobody's formally asked us. Right. This is sort of getting ahead of the game, and because we know that there is an entity that is interested in doing it, is just making it known that the county says that it is allowed under the zoning code with this amendment.
I'd like to jump in here for a minute too. And when I first saw this, I thought separation of church and state, we really don't have a say-so in this, is what I thought. But after reading all of the testimonies that were coming in, it really dawns on me that what what our past study sessions on housing strategies, let's use for as an example, the median incomes going down and the cost of housing going up, people are losing their health care. We have to come up with a solution to supplement that. And I think this is one of those supplements. I see nothing but good coming out of this, but there, you know, what has been brought up by Commissioner Pasco and Commissioner Wilson are very serious questions. You know, we're not just allowing certain denominations to do what they want to do. We have to be open to everybody. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I want to be very clear. I am 100% in support of what the current proposal is. What I'm just thinking down the road, you know, as we change this statute, what happens, right? So.
Yeah, exactly.
Why are we limiting this to churches? You have 501c3 organizations, charitable organizations. Why is this specific issue directed at churches, and why not other charitable organizations, including 501c17s, 19s? There's a whole bevy of charitable organizations that are tax exempt out there.
The reason we're only addressing places of worship in this package is that was what we were specifically directed to address by the board. It might be worth considering allowing this use in other aspects, and there might be time for that with another package of amendments, but at least in this minor and time-sensitive amendments package, we're just addressing what the specific directions of the board were for now.
Can I just ask one more question? And that's, so I think I know the answer to this, but in your opinion, it's better to change this rather than ask this one entity to go through and ask for a planning director opinion? I mean, is this really something that's going to come down over and over again, or is this an individual situation that could be addressed in a different way?
So, you know, I'm trying to be transparent. The proposal is here because of a specific entity. It is true that the Rolling Hills Community Church wants to offer this service. It's true that the board seems inclined to want them to be able to offer this service, and that's where it came from. Certainly the amendment is not limited to one church. There would be other churches that may already, and we don't know, you know, have an interest in doing this. I think there were other pathways provided as potential alternatives to the church, including the planning director interpretation that Glenn mentioned, including the potential of applying for a modification of their existing conditional use permit to basically argue that it's an accessory use and they want to, you know, have that added to what they're already approved to do. I can't speak to their reasons for why those were not their first choices. I think the code amendment provides them, if I had to guess, the code amendment will provide them with more certainty. So once the code says you can do this, then we're really not arguing about whether they can. And those other options are more discretionary. And code interpretations sometimes, you know, have their own sort of issues in terms of really maybe not being precedent setting, and you know, so there's some procedural reasons why this might be better for them. And I do believe that they're in the audience tonight, and so you may get some testimony that speaks to that, but that's my understanding.
That's helpful.
Commissioner Moss.
Thanks, Mayor. So Glenn, Jennifer, so under the 804.0 true, the accessory uses, we're only referring to G as the addition, or is F and G both added there?
I'd have to close my screen to pull it up.
Well, F is referring to childcare, but not including private or parochial school education for pre-kindergartner through grade 12 or higher education. And then G is referring to this healthcare.
Correct. We're only referring to G. The former is one of those that's just expressly listed in statute as something that can be an accessory use to a place of worship. So that's one of them that we're proposing to allow, just because it's listed somewhere else as allowed. And so just keep everything organized. But then this other one, G, is the one that's not listed anywhere else, but we're proposing to expressly mention that it is allowed.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. Yeah, because we'll visit F some other day. I got some questions there, but thanks.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll ask a real quick question. The healthcare part of it, do they have to go through licensure and inspection on that end of it? So in other words, is this someone who's already gone, an entity, a religious entity, or gone through all that up, or which I'm a little confused.
I think we're losing you, Louise. You were kind of breaking up there.
Oh,
I did hear the first part of your question, which was about whether they would have to go through licensing and I think you said inspection. So from a zoning standpoint, they may or may not need any land use review after this. I mean, it would depend upon the specific proposal and whether they were, making building modifications, adding on, whether there was some question about whether their use fell within this category. Nothing we do would change whether they need to be licensed from other licensing bodies, like from the state or federal government related to the healthcare services that they're offering. Zoning doesn't get involved with that at all, but they would need to be licensed if there are other requirements, and I would assume there are, to be licensed. And then as far as inspecting the facility itself, there could certainly be inspections from healthcare accrediting organizations, licensing bodies, and certainly the building department if they were proposing to do actual structural modifications, plumbing, electrical, and all of that. But that would happen regardless of what we do with our code.
Anything else? Okay.
All right. And the last significant issue is about an implementation period. And I touched on it briefly at the beginning of this presentation. But what the issue here is about an existing difference in the zoning code for how long a project has to be implemented before the land use approval expires. And the party may potentially have to come in and get a new land use approval when that happens. So for certain uses that are approved as a conditional use, the implementation period for the approved permit is 10 years. Those are things like a hospital and certain public facilities, things like public school or a college or a sewer treatment plant. Those types of uses, when they're approved as a conditional use, have 10 years to be implemented. However, a place of worship that also takes a conditional use permit has to be implemented within 4 years. So there's this difference. Some uses, it's 10 years that you have to implement it, but a place of worship is only 4 years. There's a concern that this distinction could be a violation of RLUIPA, which is the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, I think off the top of my head. And RLUIPA says that you can't have discrimination against places of worship in the zoning code unless the differences or the higher standards for places of worship are there to advance a compelling governmental interest, and those restrictions are the least restrictive means available for forwarding that compelling governmental interest. So right now, we may be able to articulate a compelling reason why a hospital or a public facility should be able to have 10 years to be implemented, while a place of worship should only have 4. If we can argue that that's appropriate and that difference is the least restrictive means that we have for advancing that interest, it may not be a RLUIPA violation and therefore okay. But we're not necessarily aware of there being such a compelling governmental interest, but we could talk about that as a group. It may be the case that having an allowance for a hospital to be implemented in 10 years versus 4 years makes some sense. Maybe it just takes longer to build that building and to meet all the requirements of the land use approval. Maybe these larger projects need public financing that takes a little bit longer to secure. There may be some interest in having other land uses that don't take as long to implement expire sooner, because the land use approval that has an expiration date sort of locks in an applicant to standards that applied at the time of their application. And if, for example, setback distances were to change, or parking standards or building height limitations later on, they may not necessarily have to meet those new standards if their existing land use approval is still valid. We may want projects that don't need 10 years for implementation to expire sooner, so that they are surely subject to any new standards or changes in standards that come along the way. But maybe that's not a big enough concern to continue to have this difference. To avoid the issue, staff's proposal is to repeal that unique 10-year implementation period and make things like a hospital or any public facility have to be implemented within the same 4-year period as a place of worship. But we've noticed to the public that we could consider doing essentially the opposite. We could, in this process, extend the implementation period of places of worship to 10 years to match the others. So avoiding this concern about a RLUIPA violation, and without having to have potentially these larger public projects implemented sooner. I should remind that regardless of the implementation period length, whether it's 10 years or 4 years or something else, there is already in the code and would continue to be an opportunity for a time extension, that 2-year time extension. So if the existing proposal were to be adopted and a public facility only had 4 years to be implemented, well, if 4 years approach and they are not yet finished with the project, they could come in for 2 more years. And if they still aren't able to complete the project in those 2 additional years and the approval expires, they can still come in for new approval. It would just be clearly under the existing criteria at that time.
Glenn, can I jump in? I just want to give a little context, because I'm actually been here long enough to remember when the 10-year provision was adopted. So for some background, conditional use permits used to be good for only 2 years. So the increase to 4 was, that was something we did. We relaxed, became more permissive. I don't remember exactly when that was. And during the discussion, there was sentiment among planning commissioners at the time. And again, this was many planning commissions ago, that that wasn't enough for certain, I guess I would say it was like public projects where they were concerned, I think, about bonding, maybe like school board, school bond elections and things like that. And somehow hospitals got wrapped into that discussion, that there was this need to maybe have more certainty for a longer period of time for certain types of conditional uses. That's what I recall about the discussion. It should be noted that although the comparison that we're worried about is churches versus these other ones that get 10 years because of RLUIPA, all other conditional use permits get 4. So whether it's a cell tower or a surface mine or a private school or any of these other things, they get 4 with a 2-year time extension. And in fact, nearly all of our land use applications are 4 years with a 2-year time extension. So this 10 years is an anomaly in the code. And so I think that's one reason why we kind of thought, well, let's just sync that back up with everything else. But as Glenn said, you could reverse it and give churches 10 years. The other thing to note is that implementation for most of it does vary depending on the type of conditional use, but generally it means that you need to pull your permits. It doesn't actually mean that you need to be done constructing. So if you were going to build a new public school, you would have your 4 years plus your 2-year time extension, plus however long it took you to complete construction, as long as you had pulled your permits and kept them active. So in many cases, we're talking about an approval period that's longer than 4 years. That said, you can't get a time extension if the rules have changed. So in that case, they might run up against a 4-year, and that would be the end of it if we had somehow changed our code in a way where they were no longer compliant. So just a little more context for the discussion.
Anybody?
I had my hand up. I don't know if you saw that. I was going to ask about the history, but Jennifer filled us in on that. How many of the 10-year implementation periods have been really used? In other words, is it frequent? In other words, is it really used a lot or not so much?
I'm not aware of a conditional use permit that had a 10-year implementation period that that needed it. I don't know if Jennifer is.
Yeah, it's not something we track, so there really wouldn't be any easy way to find out. Sort of anecdotally, my sense is, as Glenn said, it doesn't come up much, but that isn't to say, that it never could. But I think it's pretty minimal that people are really taking that long to implement these public uses. And we haven't had a conditional use permit for a hospital in as long as I can recall. I don't think it. Maybe an expansion of Kaiser, but I can't even remember if they actually needed a conditional use permit for that based on the zoning. So it's pretty infrequent.
I have a question or a comment here. What we're essentially doing here with this this issue is we're trying to get everything consistent and to make sure that the period for the churches and for any other facilities is the same. Am I correct with that? There's no big issue here about not being able to implement. It's just making sure everybody is under the same rules and regulations.
Correct. And we're trying to make sure, dot our I's, cross our T's, make sure that we're not treating places of worship unfairly or inconsistent with federal law. And one case that we could be is if we give an advantage to other types of land uses that we don't give to places of worship without some clear reason of why we're doing that.
I just wanted to finish. I still had a little bit more. Are we only dealing with the 10-year and the 4-year? In other words, could we suggest a different amount, like 5 years, or something in the middle, 5, 6, 7, or we just have the 10 and the 4?
Well, the issue is making sure that places of worship are treated the same as other land uses. So maybe if somebody proposed maybe not giving those hospitals and public facilities 10 years to implement, but rather just 5 years or 6 years, that to address this particular issue, we should do the same for places of worship, increase their implementation period from 4 years to 5 years or 6 years, whatever it's the case for those other uses.
That sounds like it could be a suggestion, because in case something like a hospital or a public school needs a longer period of time with those 2-year extensions, but not out to 10 and then 2. But
Now,
just facilities that down 10 years, something again.
Yeah, that's something, if I heard the question correctly, that's something that we could propose as part of this package. There could be a reduction in the 10-year at the same time as an increase in the implementation period allowance for places of worship. Staff would recommend that whatever modifications to those are proposed, that they be the same for those uses to address the RLUIPA concern.
Okay, anyone else? Okay. Anything else, Glenn?
No, that concludes my comments about what we've identified are these significant issues. And staff has in the staff report some detailed findings about how the proposal is consistent with applicable laws. We explain how the proposal, if adopted as recommended by staff in the recommendation that starts on page 18, would meet statewide planning goals. It would meet applicable provisions of Metro's Urban Growth Management Functional Plan. The proposal would be consistent with Oregon administrative rules related to uses in urban and rural reserves. That's that OAR cited there on the screen. The staff report explains how the amendments as recommended by staff would be consistent with the county's comprehensive plan and with the requirements for amending the zoning and development ordinance that are listed themselves in the zoning and development ordinance. I should be clear, as I alluded to briefly previously, that staff's recommendation is, and what was reviewed in those findings, is to amend the comprehensive plan with the text amendments included in attachment A, and to amend the zoning and development ordinance with the amendments included in attachment A, but with 2 additional changes that are not in attachment A. So if the Planning Commission wanted to recommend approval to the board of what staff is recommending, it would be the amendments in attachment A but with the following 2 changes. One I already mentioned before, which is an additional change specifically to Comprehensive Plan Policy 4F3 to make it clear that these charitable healthcare services accessory to a place of worship are allowed even in urban and rural reserves. That specific comp plan policy talks about new uses in urban and rural reserves. And I think it would be helpful if we just added some language with these amendments that clarifies that with regard to charitable healthcare services accessory to a place of worship, that's allowed in urban and rural reserves. And then one more change is recommended by staff, and that is an additional amendment to ZDO section 1107. That's the section of the zoning code specifically about property line adjustments. And this additional change that staff recommends is pretty technical and really not that exciting, but happy to explain it in more detail if you like. But basically it would be to clarify that if somebody is doing a property line adjustment that requires a plat versus a record of survey, that plat needs to be reviewed before the final plat is recorded. We don't have some of the language in that section right now, and we sort of need that. We do that, and this is just sort of a cleanup amendment. So staff's recommendation is for adoption of the text amendments in attachment A with these 2 changes. And staff finds that those amendments would be consistent with all of those various regulations and adopted documents.
Great.
So that concludes my presentation, and happy to come back to any of these.
Thank you, Glenn. Awesome. You did an awesome job. Okay, we have received correspondence on this matter. Other than the items that were included in our meeting packets, do we need to review that, Jennifer, or do we just move on to our testimonies? Looks like we have a few people waiting, possibly.
I think it would be good if, Glenn, could you just summarize, we got X number of exhibits and that's fine. I think that's sufficient. I think most, if not all of them, have been sent out to the Planning Commission already.
With Darcy's help, I believe you would have gotten an updated exhibits list on Friday. Originally, when the staff report came out, there were only 10 public comments. Many came in after the fact, and we sent them out on Friday. And then since Friday, there have been more, and we've gotten 25 more up till now. And we might have briefly just forwarded those on to the Planning Commission. They will be entered into the record formally after this hearing. They'll be assigned exhibit numbers and summarized on that updated exhibits list. And there'll be a total up to now of 80 exhibits. Of those that have come in since we sent out that package on Friday, essentially all of them were about the healthcare services accessory to places of worship, and all of them were in favor of the proposal as written. Most of them came in by email. There were 2 that came in by mail. And then there was one public comment in support of expressly allowing metal as an exterior building material. So that's the complete record to date.
Thank you. Okay, moving on. Additional reports from government agencies. Are there any other government agencies here to provide technical information related to this proposal? Okay, then I guess we'll move on. Are there any questions from the commission? I do have one, of course. Actually, I have more than that, but I wanted to ask, while we were talking about extending wastewater facilities outside the urban growth boundary and reading everything I possibly could, I never saw anything that addressed well houses or wells. So I see one end of infrastructure being addressed, but I don't see the other. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, we are proposing these amendments to address a specific issue that has come up that was only about the extension of sewer services outside of an urban growth boundary, or the routing of sewer systems components outside of UGBs to serve developments inside of a UGB, hence why we're making these changes. But the allowances aren't the same. When I was drafting these amendments, it sort of dawned on me, we're doing all this about sewer services, but what about like drinking water services? And I looked up the regulations, and there's not the same allowances as there are for sewer service uses outside of UGBs. So we're just not tackling it in this particular package, but we might be able to, in the next package, look specifically at drinking water.
Great, thank you, Glenn. Anyone else? Okay. Testimony. Are there any representatives from community planning organizations, hamlets, to speak?
So for members of the audience, if you would use the raise hand feature, right now we're just calling for anybody with a CPO or a hamlet, but soon when it's open for public testimony, please use your raise hand feature if you're wanting to speak.
Yes, thank you, John.
And I don't see anybody, Murph, from a CPO or hamlet.
Okay. Then anybody, each organ, okay, let me see. So does any other person wish to speak on these proposals? Each person will have 3 minutes to testify.
I have John Geffel, followed by Jackie Herb, and after that, Fred Wilson.
Okay. John?
Hi there. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm John Geffel. I live in Oregon City, and I'm administrative pastor for Rolling Hills Community Church. I'm also on the board of the Borland Free Clinic as well. And I wanted just to share a few comments. about a little bit about our journey of how we got to where we are with the clinic and why we feel that this code change is really very, very timely and very relevant and very important. For us as a church, our mission, just stated simply, is to reach the world one person at a time as its members learn to think, love, and live like Jesus and work to replicate that in the lives of others. And we really heed the call. When Jesus said in Matthew 14:14, he said, I'm sorry, Matthew 25. I'm not a preaching pastor. He said, he called us to serve the least of those, my brothers and sisters, for I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you invited me into your home. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick, you cared for me. I was in prison, you visited me. We really take those words very seriously. We feel that they're core to living out our faith. And that was really several years ago, birthed the vision for really to enter into some of the hard areas in our community of people who are on the margins, who are not able to get the medical care that they need, or get the clothes that they need, or to get food that they need. We are uniquely situated with a large campus. We're very unusual as a church, being that size with a 200,000 plus square foot facility. The average church size is less than 500 people. I'm actually 95% of churches are less than 500 people in the US. And so not every church necessarily can express this call the same way. And I think that's important to see, that while we may have been able to see kind of a vision and fund something like a primary care clinic that serves on a regular basis. For other churches, it may be much smaller kinds of temporary or short-term ministries that meet specific needs, but don't necessarily are expressed as a full clinic as we are. The clinic was founded as a separate 501c3. That is a very, very extensive, exhaustive, and expensive process. It means you have to be really serious to do this. And so that's why we believe that's actually a good bar to put in there. The 10%, I totally agree, is an arbitrary number. In our case, it's far, far less, 3,300 square feet out of 200,000, which is more than adequate for what we need. For many churches who are smaller and have smaller square footage, if that percentage was too small, it would mean that it was a coat closet. So it really, you need to have something that gives smaller churches the ability to have a meaningful footprint in their facility. We totally do see this as an accessory use, meaning it's accessory to our primary, which is to really serve the spiritual needs of our community, but also the physical needs that relate to those. And so that's why we are doing what we are doing. I do want to mention, there was a question about qualified medical providers. In our case, because we had a vision for a medical clinic, we went through another very extensive process, which is to get federal tort claims coverage from the FTCA, Federal Tort Claims Act, which essentially indemnifies and covers all medical providers working as volunteers in the clinic. We have a lot of requirements we have to meet on an annual basis to keep that. And all physicians have to go through a deeming process so we have to verify that their licenses are current, that they do have background checks. So there's a lot of work that goes into that effort. But that is an assurance that we can provide, because our vision was to provide the same kind of medical coverage or care that someone walking into the best clinic in the city would get. Just because they happen to not have money doesn't mean they can't get the best medical care. We do have a full-time, not a full-time, we have a volunteer medical director, Dr. Chelsea Ban, who works for Kaiser. She's an OBGYN, and she has done a phenomenal amount of work. We also have over 70 volunteers, both medical and non-medical, to serve the clinic. That concludes what I have to say.
Thank you, John. Any questions?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Mr. Jeffel, what type of medical services does your clinic provide?
Sure, good question. We're calling it a primary care because it essentially is the kind of care you'd have for someone walking into a clinic who has maybe needs a medical exam of some type, maybe has an infection they need treated. Maybe we are doing COVID vaccines with the Johnson & Johnson. We were able to get those. So vaccinations. We're not doing surgeries, we're not doing x-rays, we're not, those kinds of things. While we are a referring clinic, meaning that we partner with Legacy, Kaiser, Providence, and they provide lab services for us. So we partner with them, so we don't have to have extensive lab equipment in the facility. So it's primarily examination, prescription. We also do diabetes care, pre-diabetic care. A lot of the homeless population as well as poorer population have real struggle with diabetes because of their poor diets. And so that's an area that we have also stepped into.
Well, I appreciate everything you're doing. One of my concerns is, though, as this is worded, what if a clinic was set up, and I know this is going to be a touchy subject, but what if a clinic was set up with a church and someone came in and wanted an abortion?
Yeah, that is a touchy subject. So that would be so let me explain a little bit about the structure of the clinic for as it relates to the church. So the church has a board of elders that oversee the Rolling Hills Community Church. I'm on the elder board as well, or elder team. The elder, by the bylaws that were set up for the clinic, the elders have spiritual oversight over the faith component of the clinic. So there is intended to be a connection between the Rolling Hills elder leadership to ensure that the clinic doesn't drift from its faith foundations and from its doctrinal foundations that are expressed in the bylaws of the clinic itself. The clinic, by the way, is a 501c3 religious organization. So it is actually not a 501c3 clinic or hospital. It is actually a religious organization because we do provide faith counseling in the clinic itself. So maybe that answers that question, but that oversight puts some boundaries around what we will or won't do within the clinic.
Okay, I understand that you have boundaries, but the way this is written, it appears that any other church that wanted to apply for this could get the same consideration, and
Yes.
they could adopt a different policy. Am I correct with that?
I think there is, within what is stated in the for the accessory uses, there are only two criteria, which is space and then the 501c3. There is nothing in there that says these are the medical services you can or can't provide. So you're right. There could be a whole spectrum of services that are provided within those boundaries.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. Anyone else?
I'll just dovetail on that really quickly with the question, which is, from my perspective, it's not so much of a concern of what services are offered. It's that the providers there are qualified to offer a patient with all of the ethical options at their disposal and to lead the patient into making an informed decision, right? That's what typically medical professionals are charged with doing. Right. And it seems very clear to me that this this healthcare service is doing just that. They have physicians on staff. It's overseen by a physician. And I guess that's my question to you, John, is it clearly, from your testimony, I don't think if we added some sort of qualification along those lines, it would affect your particular clinic in any way. And my question is, would you see that as a significant barrier for other institutions like yours that want to provide this type of service to a community? It's obviously amazing what you're doing, and it's really a beautiful example of how a church can serve its community. So thank you for that. But my long-term question is, how do we make sure that we protect patients?
Yeah. If a church is going to enter into providing medical services to truly heal the sick, then you want to make sure that you have people qualified to do that. We feel that that was not even a question when we put the clinic together. So the adding a criteria like you have qualified healthcare providers. We don't see that as an obstacle at all. I've had conversations with medical people as I've talked about the clinic with them, and I've had some strong reactions sometimes from medical people thinking that is the clinic really just there so that we can talk about our faith, or are they truly getting medical care, right? And so it's really both and, not one or the other. And we really, we use Salem Alliance Church in Salem. They're located right in the city, so they have different zoning than we do, but we really modeled our approach after what they did. That's another clinic that is operated and overseen by a church. So the structure, the medical professionals involved, all were modeled after the way they did it. And we feel that if you're going to have a clinic to provide primary care services and truly meet that need, then we believe that you need to have medical professionals involved in that.
Thank you for that. And I agree 100% that it is very possible to have a clinic like this that expresses and shares your faith as you put it out, but also provide exceptional healthcare at the same time. They're not counter to each other in any way.
No.
Anyone else? John, thank you for your testimony. Very well
Thank
delivered.
you.
Yeah. Jackie, you're next. Go ahead.
Hello. My name is Jackie Herb, and I work with AKS Engineering and Forestry. AKS is in support of the proposed amendments included in this ordinance. We spent a fair amount of time reviewing all of them, and we appreciate staff putting the effort into it, and we support the proposed amendments. We work on a lot of different projects throughout the county, and we believe that the planned code amendments will be good for Clackamas County and its community members. We also submitted a letter of support that Glenn Homburg already mentioned, and we wanted to thank you for your time reviewing these, and again, we support your plan changes. Thank you.
Any questions for Jackie? Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Fred Wilson, you're next.
His hand is no longer up.
Okay. Does that conclude our testimonies? Looks like it. Any discussion? Okay, moving on. Considering continuing the hearing or holding the written record open. I think we could probably reach a conclusion tonight. Is there anyone else?
I have a question, Murph.
Absolutely.
Are we going to recommend the full package here, or are we going to vote on the individual items?
Well, we'll start with a recommendation of full package. And if we can't reach agreement on that, then we'll move to individual items. I guess that's how we'll do it. So,
It looks like we have a hand up again in the audience. I don't know if Mr. Geffel had something he wanted to add. He does have his hand up again.
okay. Back.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I checked with Fred because I knew he wanted to testify, and he said, raise your hand for me. So that's what I did. But I don't know what happens after that.
Okay,
I think he had some technical difficulties at his house.
perfect.
Okay, I got him.
Fix it.
Fred, are you there?
Hi, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. My home internet connection went out right when it was getting ready for me to testify, and I switched over to my phone, and I couldn't find a raised hand on my phone. So thank you very much. I apologize for that. Is it okay if I give a quick testimony?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay, thanks. For the record, my name's Fred Wilson. I'm with the Kellington Law Group. Our address is P.O. Box 159, Lake Oswego, Oregon 97034. And we represent the Rolling Hills Community Church. Obviously, we're in favor of the sixth proposed amendment. Pastor Geffel already spoke about what the clinic already does and the good work it does. So we wanted to thank the county for all the work they've done, the planning commission, the board of county commissioners, the planning staff, especially Ms. Hughes and Mr. Hamburg, and Ms. Renhard for running the show and getting me back on, but for doing all the work you did to sort of work with the church to try to help something that's doing such a good job keep going. Lots of local governments talk about how they work with the public and the community to do things, and a lot of places it's really just talk. So it's been really nice to see. So it's a sincere thank you from us. Since I don't have a lot of time, I won't go through the letter I submitted, but basically our position is this could be approved as just as an accessory use, but we would have to go through the individualized determination, show that it's subordinate, show that it's incidental. And I think what the proposed amendments would do would be to make that more of a non-discretionary decision. You can just look at the 10%. We sort of talked about, that could be a problem for smaller churches. I think for obviously for Rolling Hills, that wouldn't be a problem. If a smaller church needed to do that, I think maybe then they could come in with more of an individualized determination. But it would certainly be okay for Rolling Hills. I think Pastor Geffel talked about what kind of clinic it would be and how they would be totally okay with any sort of licensing requirements, and they're not going to be doing something that isn't really healthcare. That it seemed like some people were maybe concerned about that. And finally, one of the Commissioner Pasco was talking about, do we really need to have this code amendment? And Ms. Hughes was sort of explaining that when my connection went out again, so I hope I'm not repeating what she said. But we've been sort of going back and forth with the county, sort of the best way to do this, to sort of figure out whether this is okay. And so this seems like this has been sort of the path that everyone's decided is the best way to go down. And so we think this would be a great way to sort of make this a non-discretionary decision. It wouldn't involve, wouldn't have to come in every single person come in and get a determination like this. It could get approved or not approved a lot more easily. With that, I think everything else is in our letter about how this is not some sort of backdoor way to do some sort of commercial use to generate, revenue for the church. It's definitely providing something for the community rather than, trying to get something for the church. With that, I'll conclude unless anybody has any questions for me.
I'll just say
Okay.
I appreciate the clarity there. I agree with you that adding this to as an amendment would be cleaner for everyone, for yourself and anyone else that follows. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And again, thank you for letting me come back on after the technical difficulties. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And Fred, I read your letter, and yes, I actually I printed your conclusions. Yeah, long letter, took a while, but yes, thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. I'll try to be briefer in the future.
Anyone else? Okay, I think we're ready to move on. I think we're ready to close the hearing. The public testimony portion of the hearing is now closed. Is there any further questions from staff to the planet are there any further questions of staff from the Planning Commission?
I have one. Circling back to Kevin's thoughts around the square footage and the testimony that we just heard. I'm starting to question the value of that as well. And I'm curious from staff if you feel that there's a need to place a square footage requirement, or whether it's would be sufficient just to have it stand as an accessory use and make that determination as it comes across. Does that make any sense?
It does, and I think staff would recommend that we still have this floor area limitation, understanding that it would still be the case that any place of worship could come in and propose something that exceeds that 10% and explain how even that proposal is accessory to a place of worship. They could make a case in theory that having 50% of the floor area or 90% of the floor area of their facility as purely dedicated to healthcare is accessory to a place of worship on their property. So that opportunity would still be there, but this just kind of takes out of that more complicated analysis pathway that at least according to the zoning code, if it's 10%, it clearly is accessory to it, and there wouldn't need to be that application. So this creates some opportunity for cases that are certainly smaller scale, as demonstrated by that floor area limit, as being accessory, while still retaining the opportunity for people to come in and argue that even more floor area is also customarily accessory to their place of worship.
I would concur with Glenn that the use really does have to be accessory. And so we've got to have some standard for deciding that it is. And I think in this case, you know, to provide just this very clear path for Rolling Hills that they can say, yep, I checked the box and meet it is kind of the immediate need, but it doesn't foreclose, you know, somebody else, like Glenn said. You know, I was trying to think, could you do, maybe you could do an either or, although then I suppose you still have this question of its accessory. I was thinking, could you do something like 500 square feet or 10%, whichever is, you know, less, I guess, greater, whichever is greater. I'm getting myself mixed up, but you could potentially have a square footage and a percentage to accommodate the small churches. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking, well, but if it was a really, really small church, you could still end up that they're running a clinic in the entire church. Is it still accessory?
Yeah, I mean, that's my,
you know,
what I was thinking of what about that church that meets in a Grange Hall and wants to have a clinic one day a month and open up its whole, right? If we're really focused on allowing this type of use because we think it's a good for the community, I think that 10% actually is a pretty significant, it's designed to allow this one church to do this activity, right? And the question is, should it be more, or do we want it to be more, or is that a discussion for another day?
I agree with you that there could be other criteria, and that's what that would make it accessory. And that's when you get into this, can we think of them all? I mean, that's the reason why sometimes having a discretionary process is actually good for the applicant because we can't think of everything. So I think the approach of this is the clear pathway. And then, oh, by the way, you still have this option that you can come in and ask for as part of your initial conditional use permit or as part of a modification, you could request something different than what we've specified. And I think that that's, you know, I also think, just to be candid, and I've said this in the context of the discussions we've had about Rolling Hills as this has played out, is that if a church said, I'm going to offer a free immunizations one day a month, we're not going to tell them they can't do that. I mean, there's a point at which we're just going to say, it's okay. It doesn't even rise to the level of land use. And that happens all the time.
Right.
But at some point, you know, it's a gray area. At some point you cross over. And I think in this case, there would be two different pathways that people could get to something that's bigger, but still accessory.
Right.
That was my question. Was this going to address temporary? The dental clinic that shows up every other month, or the blood mobile or something of that nature that parks out in the parking lot. So I'm taking for granted that this is not going to address that type of issue.
Correct. We have longstanding policies that kind of say, look, there's a certain amount of stuff that can go on out there that we're just not in the business of regulating because it's not feasible or desirable to do so.
Right, exactly. Okay.
Are we going to take a break? We usually do if the meeting is going on a long time.
Yes, we've been going for 2 hours. So everyone up for a break, a 5-minute break? Okay, I think we're back. Louise, are you around? Michael? Ah, there you are. Okay. Christian Wilson, are you around?
Saw Michael take himself off mute, so I think he's there.
Yep, he's here.
Okay, great. Okay, is there a motion to move forward? Or do we need more discussion?
I guess from my perspective, it seems, at least from my perspective, with the exception of the a discussion about whether it should be 10% or not, the rest of the motion, the rest of the items, I'm support without really any proposed amendments. So I'm wondering whether it makes sense to split them off, or do we discuss how we may want to recommend something different for that item and then include it with an overall amendment? I guess it's just a question in my mind.
I can concur with that. I think it might be worth just a quick discussion among us about whether we can find a workable solution for the healthcare, health services piece. And then I think that we could potentially move everything at once. I agree. I'm comfortable with everything else staff has recommended.
Could we limit square, or put a minimum of square footage, perhaps, within the building? I'm just, let's say you have 200 feet.
I guess I was, before we took the break, I raised my hand, and I guess I was thinking that given Jennifer's idea of perhaps it's a 10% or some minimum square footage, which makes it perhaps easier for a place of worship that's smaller, and this doesn't just benefit the larger places of worship. That's where I was concerned with, is just to come up with something that makes it as easy for a smaller place of worship to do this as it would be for the one that's being proposed, which they have a huge facility, so this isn't a big deal for them. So some combination that but also recognizing, as Jennifer pointed out, it's not like the door is closed. It's going to be interpreted with some reasonableness, depending on the circumstance and so forth. But I just want to make sure we don't make it more burdensome for the smaller communities than the larger ones. That would be my only concern.
Why do we even need a specification on a minimum footage? You could have a doctor come in and have it in office and do examination, and that, that doesn't take up much space. Why do we need a specific amount of space?
Or more to the point, there are other provisions in the code that allow for example, elementary schools, right? And I guarantee you they're taking a lot more than 10% of that church's space. So why should this provision be any different?
That's what I'm looking at as well, looking at the list, especially looking at like the meal programs that use a large thing, that there's no space on that. So I'm just looking at being consistent with the other uses.
I agree with that. That's why I was asking staff earlier whether they felt that it was really necessary and why this is different from some of those other uses.
And if a person is not comfortable with one of the aspects of this whole package, I guess then if we don't separate it, then they just have to vote against the whole package, correct?
Commissioner Lopez, if you want to say something and talk about it.
Well, I just have real concerns with mixing secular with religious. I'm a very secular person, and I know these churches are trying to do a good thing, but mixing healthcare and religion and proselytizing, and my worry is that the people who come in for the healthcare may or may not be fully informed, that they're not going to be able to get all health services that you would get, say, at Kaiser, which is not a religious organization. Their health services are going to be limited by that religious organization's belief. And I don't believe that their healthcare services should be limited by any, religious belief unless they are fully consenting to that. And so I almost feel like it's a vulnerable population that they're trying to serve, these folks who can't get healthcare elsewhere, and they're not going to get the full range of services. So I have just some strong secular concerns. And because of that, that piece of this whole thing is something I cannot vote for. Now, the other pieces of the ZDO are fine. So, and you don't need my vote to, it can be always, I can always decide.
We're losing Louise a little bit, but I'll second that. I honestly, I have similar concerns, which is why I feel pretty strongly about having wording in here that requires oversight by a qualified medical professional. I think that any qualified medical professional understands the importance of ensuring that the patient makes an informed decision, whether or not they can offer those services at that particular point, at that particular place may be an issue, but at least the patient is informed about those options, for what that's worth.
Yeah, I guess I would add, though, that there's a lot of other large medical institutions that are religious-based. Providence, for example, St. Adventist Hospital, and so forth. So I've never felt that I've been we primarily use Providence for I've never felt like, because I'm part of Providence, that they're trying to push any type of religious agenda when I go for their services. So I can see where, where it's an individual church that might be a concern, but yet I think we have lots of places throughout the country that are religious-based hospitals and medical providers that aren't there primarily to promote their religious beliefs. They're there to provide medical services. So I'm less concerned about that from my perspective. I think perhaps to your point, though, Louise, perhaps we should break out the rest, the ones that we all concur on, and vote on that. And then we would vote on this one separately. And that way it would better reflect, your specific views on the items than if we do it as a blanket. So just a thought.
I'm comfortable with that.
We can do that.
How should I separate that? Yeah, should I title that as,
Someone just moved, we accept all the recommendations with the exception of this one.
okay, then, okay,
Murph, if it makes it easier, I'll make a motion to, I can make a motion to basically accept the staff amendment with the ZDO section 1107, the second point in Glenn's memo, and we can circle back to the first one. Does that make sense?
thank you, Brian.
So I'm looking at page 19. I'm just going to move the proposed motion there, which is to, I move approval and recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners of the recommended proposal as drafted in attachment A, with an additional amendment that ZDO section 1107 be added to clarify that a preliminary plat shall be reviewed and a final plat shall be recorded for any PLA that qualifies as a replat under ORS chapter 92. So I think that would take care of everything except for the religious, the health services provision, and we can circle back to that.
If that, you might want to specify that your motion does not include the proposed amendments to section 804 then. Because the amendments in attachment A would include the amendments to section 804, including the 10%.
Right, so I will amend that. Darcy, are you tracking that, that my motion does not include the amendments to section 804?
And one point of clarification, because I was sort of trying to flag things you talked about. There was some discussion about the 4-year versus the 10-year versus something in between 4 and 10 years for churches. And as drafted, it will be 4 years for churches and those secular uses. And just making sure everybody's got that we're all good with that.
I'm good with that.
I'm good with it.
I'm good with 4 years for everything.
Brian, I'll second your motion.
Thanks, Kevin.
Okay, let's go for a vote.
So we're voting on everything but the one part about the healthcare with the religious services.
Exactly, that's right.
And we're keeping the length of time for them to have their open application to 4 years for everybody.
Right.
Okay.
At this time, I call for a vote. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed? Abstentions? Motion passes. Public,
Would it be helpful for me to move the other provision and then we can discuss it and decide whether to vote it up or down? And my intent would be to move the proposed amendments to section 804 along with a recommendation that we add a provision that there be qualified healthcare providers associated with that. I would leave it up to staff to figure out the language specifically before it goes to the county BCC. Does that make sense to you, Jennifer?
Yes, and then you might want to consider whether you want to capture Glenn's second requested change on that last slide, which was the conforming
Okay.
amendment to chapter 4 of the comprehensive plan.
Okay.
We think we need that for the reserves.
Okay. Let me ask you,
Brian?
are you comfortable with me making that motion, Murph? Or?
yes, I am, Brian.
Okay.
I was just gonna say, Brian, but it adds that they're qualified healthcare professionals, but it doesn't necessarily bring in the part about
We're losing you again, Louise. I think I know where you were. Is anyone else hearing her? Or is it just me? Okay.
No.
Yeah, it's cutting. Yeah, I'm sorry, my
You're back. Try it
my
again.
connection's bad. Right, informed consent by the patients. Your amendment doesn't include that, and I'm just concerned that the patients aren't fully aware of the limitation of the services they can receive if it's being promoted as this great health clinic that does everything for everybody, and it wouldn't provide all services.
Right. And the question is whether I would look to staff. I don't, becomes really hard to regulate that. And it's questionable whether it's the purpose of the planning department of the zoning code to regulate that.
Yep.
And that's where it comes down to me that my comfort level is that if there are qualified and licensed medical professionals overseeing the clinic, that, that's part of their training, is to make sure that they're getting informed consent from their patients. Makes sense to anyone else, but
I guess I would argue that, it's fairly clear what services they're in the example we have that they're providing. They're providing primary care services. It seems to me that a patient comes in and says, I have a cold, I need to be treated for it. And this clinic, for whatever reason, says, well, we don't treat those kinds of things. Then the patient would just go somewhere else. So I'm not quite sure what your concern is, Louise.
Okay, from a woman and a woman's rights perspective, if the patient comes in, young woman, and she's pregnant, and she says, I don't want this baby, I want it gone, I want it gone now. Instead of since they're not going to provide an abortion, instead of sending her to
You cut out again, Louise.
losing her again, but I will try and capture some of that. I'm sorry. Louise, you just keep coming in.
Might not choose to have that child. Again, this is way too much of a respected person, so I'll just dissent, and that'll just be the end of it, and that's fine.
I think that my concern is that, if an entity is offering counseling services with people who are not qualified to be counselors, is another example of this happening, right? And we've seen examples of that around the country where pseudo health clinics are set up without appropriate providers, and therefore the patients don't understand the services they're getting or their options that are available. And again, I think, to me, if there's qualified licensed providers there, that gets us 90% of the way to preventing that potential problem.
Glenn, do we have state law that covers some of this that you would know of?
No, this being minor and time-sensitive amendments, we've focused very little on this as a larger policy idea of allowing healthcare on a broader sense. We really are trying to focus a change to the zoning code to address one specific type of need that has been addressed, which is an ambiguity of whether a place of worship providing healthcare services, not as their primary function, not as a function of the majority of their buildings, but rather as just an ancillary function going on their property, it could be an allowed use. It may already be allowed, depending on what somebody proposes, but we're just trying to make sure that it's clear that this one particular minor type of land use is allowed, while still leaving the opportunity for consideration of more than that.
And if I could just sort of chime in, I think one concern I have from a code structure perspective is that we allow healthcare services in all kinds of other places in the county, and we don't regulate what they are. We don't talk about licensing. We don't talk about what their obligations are to their patients. I think there's a lot of really good points that have been raised. I'm just trying to figure out how many of them are really relevant to land use.
I hear that.
And for instance, I actually don't know. I mean, Providence, that was an example Tom used, as a Catholic-based organization. I have no idea if they have a legal obligation to refer women for particular types of services or not, but I can tell you it's not in the zoning code. So I am a little hesitant to go down this road too far. And for us to know in planning who qualifies as a qualified healthcare professional, or how many of them they would have to have, or how many hours they would have to be there, we're starting to get into an area that makes me think we're not going to have the capacity to regulate that very well. So I'll just throw that out there for thought.
So maybe, I was gonna say, just so maybe healthcare belongs separate from religion, and therefore we shouldn't be zoning to mix and muddy the waters of the two. To me, if religious organizations off doing their religion and the healthcare is off doing their healthcare.
I think, Jennifer, I think you hit it on the nail on the head where I was going, that let's just,
Scale.
Yeah, Louise, you're cutting out.
Go ahead, Kevin.
let's just stick to the
Yeah, I
topic
know.
at hand, that what is within our scope and what is without. And yeah, you're right. It's not our job to tell the religious organization what they should and should not provide. That is not within our scope.
I agree.
Yes. I think we're going down a dangerous road right
Yeah.
here. The Board of County Commissioners take that one.
Yeah.
But yes,
I guess back to the proposed motion. So there's a component that Brian has been advocating for, which is that they have medical professionals that are licensed and whatnot. And so is that going down the road where we are being too prescriptive or not? Is my question.
That was what why I originally asked Glenn of whether there's some sort of definition elsewhere in the code, and it sounds like there's not.
Correct. And I at least am not entirely clear what the proposal would be. I understand there's some consideration of having a qualified or maybe a licensed healthcare provider, but does that mean that they have to be on site during all hours of operation? What is the verb that you're looking to have added to this for this person?
Yeah.
are you telling interns that they cannot take any action as a volunteer or as an intern, so to speak, in this particular facility?
I guess from my perspective, after listening to John, they've kind of really thought this through. So they get what they're getting into from a medical perspective. They've done their research. They're getting their, the legal aspect of it covered to protect themselves. So I would say, for the most part, it's probably a low risk, because it's, when you start giving out medical services, you're entering into some pretty serious territory here. So any organization that wants to try to start doing that would have a whole host of other legal obligations before they could go do something like that. And so it seems to me that those are probably already in place, and that they don't necessarily need to be included in the zoning ordinance specific. I do think we need to clarify this 10% issue because that is a specific zoning issue that could have some detrimental effect, more detrimental effect on some religious organization compared to others. If we start going down this, where we start telling our staff is now required to be able to somehow verify that they have the qualified staff and whatever, which we don't do for any other business when they go and want to build something. We don't validate that they know what the hell they're doing when they want to build whatever plant they want to build. I think we're kind of getting beyond our mission here
Yeah, I'm
down that path.
becoming persuaded by that. I guess to answer Glenn's question, you know, my inclination would be that any patient care would be overseen by a licensed medical provider. But as everyone has pointed out, I think that that's already required by state law. And if they are running a medical clinic, that there are other laws that will be applicable to them in that perspective. That it really, I'm persuaded that it really has no relationship to land use. I agree with
Then
that.
why are we having to sanction this?
Because
It's conditional use.
church is legally operating a medical clinic, and it's questionable whether they can do that from a land use perspective. And they're following all other state laws to do that, and they're coming to us to ensure that they can actually physically do that on their land in accordance with the zoning ordinance.
And I guess
Here.
what I'm looking at is we don't want, you want to have some ability to make sure the intent of the land use laws are being complied with. And so if we were silent on it, for example, a religious organization could say, well, there's nothing that prevents me from turning my church into a medical facility. I mean, and even though zoning codes wouldn't normally allow that to happen on that site. So I think what we're trying to do is recognize that, well, that's not a bad use of the property, even though it wasn't intended for that use when it was originally permitted, and in the current zoning doesn't allow it. But you know, there could be an exception here. This allows for an exception that's done in a way that's easy for staff to administer, and at the same time gives a religious organization some flexibility to do other things that they think can be beneficial to society, which clearly this would be. So to me, it's really about, yes, we need to acknowledge it because it is a use that's different from what the original permit allowed. But we also need to be careful that it's clear enough as to how you enforce it, and not, you know, too onerous for some versus others. That's kind of how I'm looking at it. It's the dilemma.
May I just ask, how does the insurance look at it? You know, if you're going from a church to a care facility, you have to carry some kind of insurance that covers that. And that could dictate what kind of square footage you can have, so to speak. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
What I'm seeing here is we've got a church that is doing a great job and is asking for some assistance or somewhat sanctioned by the county, but that is one specific church. What's going to happen down the road? We don't know what the next church is going to look like. And that's where my main concern is. We're looking at one specific church. Great job. But what about the next one or the one following that? And we're sanctioning that?
Well, we would be sanctioning the activity up to 10% of the square footage of the building, which is arguably limited pretty significantly. And whether or not, I think the argument has been that whether or not they are doing those activities legally or successfully is for another agency to decide, and not the Clackamas County Planning Department.
I guess, Michael, to your point, I think what we're trying to do is provide amendment to zoning codes that sets some ground rules for future churches or religious organizations to do what this particular church is doing. So it's not well, gee, what are we going to do about this one? The code doesn't address it. So I think that's really all we're doing. is trying to codify it in a way where it makes it easier for staff to address these types of requests when they come up. So that's how I see what we're doing. The problem we're having is are we being too specific with 10%? That's kind of, in my opinion, that's the only part about it that I'm wrestling with. On the other hand, you got to pick something, some number, and whatever you pick, we will be able to argue why that number is, or that approach isn't any better. There's always going to be an exception. So,
Well, but again, I don't think we have to pick anything. And
Yeah.
coming back to Kevin's argument that we're not requiring this elsewhere, so why would we do it here? I would love to hear.
What if we have some kind of a cult come in? I mean, I'm going off the rails here, but what if we, there are some strange cults out there that are, detrimental to society, and they could be classified as a religion, a church.
I think, Michael, that's covered under the First Amendment. So that again is not within our scope.
Nope.
Well, but they also would not be entitled to provide healthcare services to the public without being licensed, because otherwise they would be, at risk of, practicing without a license, which comes with a pretty significant fine, all of which is outside the scope and not regulated by the planning department.
So if I could just respond to Brian, I think it was Brian who asked this question, or a couple of you have, like, why are we setting 10% for this and we don't for other? I mean, our code right now is a mix. We do have a number of accessory uses where we are very specific. Home occupations, they're an accessory use, but they're only allowed if they're subject to this laundry list of standards that have been adopted. Accessory dwelling units, they're allowed, but they're only allowed subject to certain standards, including a square footage maximum. So it's not out of the ordinary to have an accessory use with very prescribed standards. Having said that, there's a lot of other cases where you're right. The number of activities that go on in a school, I mean, at some point though, I'm not even sure if it's really an accessory use or it's actually just part of the primary use of being a school. So there's a lot of different permutations. With this one, I think the goal is to give them a clear path and not to foreclose other churches from doing it through maybe not a clear path. So I think we can do an either or. We can do a 10% or otherwise accessory too. And if you want, we could add some language. I'm not going to try to draft it sitting here, but we could do that to be even really more explicit that there's this other pathway. You could also do a square footage like we talked about. It could be, 500 square feet or 10%. Maybe 10% seems small, you want to go to 20. Any of those things I think would mitigate some of the concerns that I'm hearing about foreclosing smaller churches from being able to take advantage of that. And I think you could choose any of those pathways and still give Rolling Hills a clear path to what they're doing right now.
Jennifer, I agree with you that there elsewhere in the zoning code, we have variety of different standards, but I'm looking specifically at section 80402, which lists worship services, religious classes, weddings, funerals, meal programs, childcare, right? None of that is subject to a 10% limit. And all of a sudden,
correct,
we're not going to subject A through F to that limitation, but we're going to subject G, and I just don't understand why.
So I don't have it, Glenn, does all that whole list have that lead-in language about it still has to be customary? I can't remember if the list, if it's clear that they are automatically customarily accessory no matter what.
The
or
following may be permitted as uses accessory to the place of worship.
Right, and the reason why those A through F don't have a square footage limitation is because they're allowed by state law without a square footage limitation. It's the county that is choosing to propose expanding that list that's provided in state law to also allow something that state law doesn't mention is expressly an accessory use of a place of worship. Clackamas County is looking to clarify that for our purposes, healthcare services can also be an accessory use, but we don't allow healthcare services In any other capacity in, for example, rural residential zones, you could only run a healthcare service under this proposal when it's accessory to a place of worship. So we have to get at what it means to be accessory. Does accessory mean occupying the entire church's building by 95%, 7 days a week, and only having other church services once a month? Maybe not. But in one particular case, we're thinking that, well, healthcare services that only occupy 10% of the floor area probably are accessory to the other church operations. And so therefore, let's spare somebody from having to go through a similar use interpretation application and just say at least that particular type of thing really is also an accessory use. Well, again, not closing the door on potentially more square footage, even up to 95% of it every single day, may be an accessory use, but somebody would need to explain how that's the case. We can't allow a new use in the zone or in a rural reserve, but we can clarify that certain accessory uses are allowed.
Yeah, it almost, Glenn, it almost then leads into, it opens the door to say the planning commission is now going to regulate the healthcare services like ours. And I think that should be up to the individual churches. We give the churches the option, and then however they choose to provide those services, when they choose to provide their services, that's up to the church. And they're subject to state standards, and it's not on the county or us.
So just if I clarify what you're saying, Kevin, are you saying it doesn't need to be defined as an accessory use?
So I'm saying we just define it as healthcare services, including county, operated by a 501c3, and we just drop any language relating to what the square footage or any percentage.
And I would be personally comfortable with that because of that opening language in 80402, which says, including this new G, can be permitted as an accessory use, right? And I think the accessory use is more important than the square footage percentage.
So if you're going to go along with that, walk me through how this would work. So that would this mean that there's no conditional use process or anything associated with a church deciding to open a clinic, or it's just allowed outright and you don't have any say over how big it or what they do there? I'm just trying to understand what we're allowing when we say that.
I think the latter of what you just said. We're opening it up, and it's up to the church to decide what works best for them.
So long as the clinic is secondary to the primary purpose of providing church services.
Okay.
Yes.
And so who determines whether it's secondary or not?
Well,
The planning department, through a discretionary decision that requires them to file an application with notice to neighbors and the right to appeal.
I mean, don't we pretty much do that with any accessory use that we authorize?
No, not always. It depends if the standards are discretionary or not. So for example, if somebody comes in to apply for an accessory dwelling unit, they submit a building permit, it meets the clear and objective standards, it's approved over the counter.
Right.
But if somebody comes in and wants to do an accessory use that's got discretion to it, then they need a land use application. Correct. So we have both pathways, and your recommendation could be to go either way.
And your argument is by setting it a specific percentage, you get rid of the discretion and it becomes an objective decision. Okay.
Yes.
That's helpful.
the
I
argument.
didn't fully grasp
Correct.
that before.
Yes.
If we, just to build onto that, if we were to remove the square footage limitation in G and just rely on the existing, the remainder of the amendment, that wouldn't help Rolling Hills Church. It wouldn't clarify whether their specific use is indeed an accessory use. This amendment, by setting a clear number, says it is an accessory use and they don't have to do anything more, while not closing the door on anybody else that wants to do more than 10%.
So allowing healthcare services, including counseling, doesn't give them the clear path?
Because it's discretionary, they would have to come in and make an application that it qualifies as an accessory use, right? I get
They would
that.
have to explain how they are an accessory use while still potentially occupying 90% or 10%. It doesn't answer their question of whether or not it's allowed.
So then in this particular, if this was, the zoning ordinance was in place prior to Rolling Hills deciding to open this, what would the process be for them? Do they do anything? Do they apply for a permit or anything, or they just go ahead and do whatever they want to do because it's allowed? I'm just curious how this would work.
With the 10%, it would be they would have a presumed accessory use, and so they can just move forward without
Move forward.
permission.
Okay.
As opposed if we made it, if we didn't include the 10%, they would make an application to the planning commission, the planning.
And have to go
Just
through.
to make this even more complicated, but because I can't help myself, I just have to, disclose it. There is, in my mind, and I don't know if Fred's still in the audience, Fred Wilson, but he and I may be having a conversation about this eventually. I think there's a question about accessory uses that are accessory to a conditional use permit under our code. It's not entirely clear. So a church is a conditional use, a place of worship is a conditional use virtually everywhere it's allowed.
Right.
Or maybe a couple little oddities, but generally it's conditional use. So you come in, you want to develop a new church, you need a land use application. You file it, it goes to notice to neighbors, there's a public hearing, there's a decision, it's appealable, the whole deal. As a typical matter, the church is proposing the church and anything else they want to do. So they tell us we're having Sunday school, they tell us we're having, we're going to build a storage building out back for various, whatever, the whole application comes in together. So it's usually not necessary to parse this. Is it accessory? Is it primary? Because they give us the whole package. There have been applications where we've had discussions about whether something is a customary accessory use, where a church is maybe proposing something like, let's say, a bookstore, a religious bookstore, which is not listed. Is it or is it not accessory? Because you cannot do a bookstore in a rural residential zone, generally speaking. It's not allowed. So those discussions have happened, but generally it all comes in together. Well, if they come in with an accessory use later, it's a little unclear whether the code whether it really means they need another conditional use permit or not. I think I can make an argument that they do, but it's not clear. And so I just think, the problem they've had up to now with this particular site is that our code already allows customary accessory uses. They could already file an application and argue that this use is customarily accessory. But what they're looking for is something that gives the sideboards, that says, yes, you are. And to the extent we can, we're trying to provide that. While I'm still telling you there's this little question in my mind about whether accessory uses to conditional use permits still require some kind of review, even if we know for sure that it's accessory. I still think that would give them a benefit though, because they would be coming to us just talking about any impacts of their use and not talking about whether the medical clinic in and of itself is permitted. So regardless of the answer to whether they need another land use permit, this is still beneficial to them. Anyway.
On that note, Jennifer, I think I'll just throw out a motion here and see where we land. So I move we approve comprehensive plan policy 4.f.3 that allows charitable healthcare services accessory to a place of worship, even in the urban and rural reserves, and as recommended by plan staff, section G, with the percentage being no more than 25%.
But once again, what we're talking about is one specific church here. We're going to be setting a precedence here for other churches, whatever they are. We're so concerned about this one church that we're not thinking about what's down the road.
I will second Kevin's motion just for purposes of discussion. I'm still thinking about all this stuff. And I actually am coming back to, I thought the whole purpose here was to give this church a clear path forward. But what I'm hearing from Jennifer is that there's a bunch of other stuff they would have to.
No, what you're hearing from Jennifer is that I'm not really entirely sure of
Right.
the answer to that question, but I still think that even if they would have to file something, they're not going to be arguing about whether their medical clinic is the right size, whether it's associated with the mission of their church, whether it wouldn't be that discussion. It would be a question of whether they need a modification of their conditional use permit just to address any impacts of that added use. And by impacts, I mean like traffic or noise or the kinds of things you look at with a conditional use permit.
Right.
That kind of thing. Because you can imagine a scenario where a conditional use might have 27 accessory uses associated with it. And by the time it's done, you've added a significant impact to what's going on in the neighborhood. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here. I'm just saying I can play that out for a whole host of other accessory uses, for a whole host of other conditional uses, none of which is what we're really discussing tonight. But it eliminates this question about whether the use itself is permitted in the zone. And that's the first question they were going to need to ask us. That was the path they were going down before this code amendment. And so I still see this as being a benefit to them, regardless of whether they end up having to modify their conditional use permit.
So if I could play that back, because what I'm concerned about is that I think if a facility decides to change what they originally set out to do, with this amendment as proposed by Kevin, they would still have to go through some kind of a process to move forward with this because it's a change to their original conditional use. Is that fair? Or once it's permitted as a conditional use, there's no process really for them to go through. In other words, so there's no way to evaluate, impact the neighbors, traffic, and all that other stuff that normally what is part of what the zoning process allows you to demonstrate those types of impacts are going to be detrimental or not. So still struggling with the whole, whatever we pass, does it just mean they can kind of do what they want and planning staff really has no more say about what other impacts it might have from a zoning perspective or not? I guess that's what I'm trying to understand. And then back to the 25%, I'm curious what staff thinks about the larger number since you had recommended 10.
Well, I can address that question. Nobody's asked us to allow for more. And again, keeping in mind our goal is to illustrate something that is an accessory use to something else happening on the property. I guess it's a judgment call of what is the upper limit of being considered an accessory use. Rolling Hills Church has illustrated that 10% would be sufficient for them, but maybe for some smaller footprint places of worship, 10% isn't enough. And therefore, maybe having some absolute minimum is another option. You know, it could be 10% or 5,000 square feet, whichever is greater. But 25% could be just fine too, if that is illustrative of being ancillary to, subordinate to, an accessory to something else happening on the property.
I thought Kevin's motion said 25% maximum, not minimum. No minimum, just maximum. Am I correct there, Kevin?
You are correct.
Yes.
So let me ask another question, which gets back to Tom's question of, you know, if we eliminated the percentage, they would have to come through for an accessory, to prove an accessory use, which would eliminate Tom's concern about future churches, you know, not having a review. It would create some burden on this particular church But from everything I can see, one, they've got a pretty no-brainer case. And two, they have the resources to move that through the planning department without a major hurdle. And so I guess I would push back. I'm still wondering, you know, I appreciate the desire to make this as easy as possible on this church, which is doing a really great thing. At the same time, I wonder if not including the percentage actually provides the longer term protections from a zoning amendment standpoint that we would desire. I guess I would put that back on staff. Am I missing something about how complicated it really would be for them to request to make an argument that before the department that they're an accessory use, that this is an accessory use to their church?
You know, obviously I cannot predict the outcome of any future application. I'll go into my legalese, right? But I think the biggest question in staff's mind about whether this use that they're operating would qualify is the nature of the use, the fact that it's medical services and whether those are customarily accessory to a place of worship. That has been our concern far more than whether they could show that the hours of operation and the size and all of that are, you know, I don't think they're going to have a hard time demonstrating that it's accessory,
right,
based on the scope. So from that standpoint, if you were to eliminate the percentage, but it needs to be clear, I think it is clear, and Glenn and I can look at this language later. It's not significant for, I don't think, for your purposes tonight, but as long as it's clear that we're still saying it has to be accessory to, right? Then if you drop the square footage, but you state that it's medical services and that it's charitable medical services, so that we're not talking about a commercial concern being accessory to a church, then I think they would file a modification of their existing conditional use permit, and there would be notice, and staff would issue a decision, and it's appealable if somebody disagrees with it. That's what would happen. And I guess what I'm saying is that might have to happen anyway.
Right. And the only difference is they would have to make an argument that they're an accessory use, which for everything we're seeing is a pretty straightforward argument for them to make.
Glenn, do we know what our neighboring counties are doing?
No, we didn't look into that.
I can almost assure you that our neighboring counties have not considered this issue. I would be almost willing to bet, but I can't swear to it.
Based on that, I'm inclined to not have a percentage. I think that gets us where we need to be, and it really doesn't create that big of a burden on this organization. They're probably going to have to go through this process anyway. It's just one extra little step.
I agree.
So Darcy, can we check procedurally? Kevin made a motion. Was there a second?
I second.
Brian seconded
Okay,
it.
so we're in discussion now. Got it.
Yes.
So with that, Brian, if you're accessible to it, I could just say amend my motion and just strike any reference to percentage of floor space for the structures.
And I would second that. Is that clear? It goes mud to you, Darcy.
I think that's where I was at regionally is what I was gonna propose.
I think that the technical procedure would be you're withdrawing your previous motion and you're remaking a motion to strike with that struck, and I seconded it.
And then just point of clarification, your motion is that it would remain an accessory use, just that there would be no square footage.
Yeah,
correct.
So let me ask this question of the planning department there. What is there something that says an amount of space for an accessory use? No. So a church could then, what we're talking about here, could then use 100% of their church for a clinic if we don't have a maximum for accessory use. Am I correct with that?
Only if they could successfully argue that it's accessory, which it's discretionary. And as I think some people have mentioned, it would not be entirely unlike other accessory uses that we have that don't have specified but they're going to have to demonstrate that it's accessory, meaning that it's basically subordinate to the primary use. So if you were running it in 100% of the square footage, 7 days a week, and you had a church service once a week for 15 minutes, you're not going to meet that test. So the question is, where's the line? I can't tell you, but there will be a lot of discretion to it to determining whether it's accessory or not.
So for clarity, the proposal is, if you're looking at page 19 of Glenn's memo, 80402, there's a preamble that lists a bunch of things, and it clearly says the following may be permitted as uses accessory to place of worship. And what Kevin is proposing is in section G is eliminating the clause that says provided the healthcare services occupy no more than 10% of the combined floor area of all the structures associated with places of worship on the same property. We would be eliminating that from the staff proposal.
Correct.
Wow. Now we've got Planned Parenthood coming in and setting up a church. Wow.
I don't think that's what this is saying.
I don't think so either.
So, plus, we've never talked about synagogues or mosques or meeting halls. It seems like the whole organization, this is all about one Christian church, and it's very biased and very narrow. We're not being embracing other cultures and other faiths. And yeah, that's why I am against this whole thing. I mean, it's adverse to everything I believe in. There's other organizations, you might call them cults, but there are other actually like Wiccan, whatever. That's considered a faith. It's recognized by the state. There are other organizations too. So Planned Parenthood has got so narrowly based. It's just all narrow.
I don't, with all respect to Louise and Michael, I don't believe that that's what this amendment is doing, right? It's allowing any place of worship to offer healthcare services that are accessory to their primary purpose of providing a church.
Correct.
They would, and if they're offering medical services, they're still going to be subject to a whole host of state and federal requirements. All we're doing is saying that it is okay for these churches to offer needed services to their communities.
I perfectly understand, Brian, but I think the ambiguity here is just open for future problems.
You may be completely right on that, Michael, but I don't think those problems are planning commission related problems.
Right now, we have some problems that we need to deal with as far as people being underserved. And that's what this church is trying to do. And we need to continue this service that allows people that want to give. And I think we're going down the right path here. I like this discussion. We're being discretionary. And we need to vote pretty soon because we're going to be at 10 o'clock. So
we have a motion and a second, so we can vote right now. I think we kind of know where it might fall, but I don't see any reason why we shouldn't.
I'm going to raise a point of order. I'd like to be this a roll call vote.
Okay. Roll call. Hey,
I'm just going to add one more comment, which is that from a land use perspective, the land use impacts of a healthcare services is probably less than the other things that are allowed under this provision, including childcare and meal programs, right? I understand what y'all are saying, but from a land use perspective, the impacts are not that significant.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to see a proliferation of churches out there trying to provide medical. I mean, this particular organization sounds like it's very large and has the ability to pull something like this off. So I don't anticipate we seeing a lot more. But at the same time, we shouldn't close the door for organizations that want to try to do this. And it looks like we've got the safeguards in place to make sure they're doing it within land use laws. So I'm okay with the way it's being proposed. I don't have any concerns.
Commissioner Murphy, would it be okay, just to make sure I understand what the motion is, and I'll just restate it, and maybe for Darcy as well. I heard the motion as a motion to adopt the amendments to section 804 as proposed in attachment A, but with two changes. One of the changes would be to subsection G, such that there is no square footage limitation. And then also there would be an additional amendment to comprehensive plan policy 4F3 to clearly identify that charitable healthcare services accessory to a place of worship would be allowed even in urban and rural reserves. Is that the motion others that was made?
Yes.
Yes.
That I seconded, yes.
Yeah. Come on.
Great job, Glenn. Thank you. I think we're ready to vote.
Okay, roll call. Darcy, you do roll call.
Commissioner Moss,
Yes.
Commissioner Peterson,
Yes.
Commissioner Lopes,
No.
Commissioner Pasco,
Yes.
Commissioner Wilson,
No.
Commissioner Murphy.
Yes. Motion passes. This public hearing is now closed.
Thanks as always, Glenn.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yes,
Good to
a
see
lot of
you
work in
all
this. Yeah.
from the glow of my monitor. And
Excellent job, Glenn. Excellent job once again.
thank
Yep.
you all for your patience jumping through just a huge package of issues back and forth. And I still feel like this is a good way to get a bunch of things done at once, but I also appreciate that, boy, it could cover all sorts of things. So I appreciate
Yes.
it.
Yeah, and I appreciate how you were able to narrow it down and kind of get it focused on what the key issues were.
That was really helpful.
That was
Yeah.
very, very helpful. So Mike, kudos to you as well.
Your help getting me through this. Thank you very much.
Good night, everybody.
Good night,
See you.
Glenn.
Take care.
Do you have other business?
Other
You have
business? Oh, yeah.
minute, you have minutes to approve.
Mr. Chair, I move to approve the minutes as presented to the Planning Commission.
Have a second.
Kevin,
I'm
can you
sorry,
tell me
who-
what the date? Can you just
Yeah, was
clarify what
there-
the date is?
June
The
June
date
28th.
of, yeah, June 28th
Thank
minutes.
you.
Mhm.
Thanks, Kevin.
I'm sorry, who is the second?
I'll second that.
Michael?
Thank you.
All in favor, say aye.
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 All opposed? Anyone abstain? Okay. Okay, motion passes. Any other business?
I have just wanted to, yes, I want to circle back on the remote meetings questions. So we talked about it last time. I understand there are some strong feelings. And I need to tell you that there have been a couple developments at the county level that are actually, well, one at the county level and one at the state level that are actually going to influence what we do moving forward. So the first thing was we had, there's a feeling among, I think, a number of people at the county, including in our public and government affairs staff, that the remote meetings have actually offered people who sometimes are underrepresented at public meetings an opportunity to participate. It's easier for people to be here virtually when they, don't have to drive in from long distances, across the county, or maybe they've got work commitments for like our land use hearings during the day or childcare issues or whatnot, that they're able to participate more than they than they were before. I don't know if I've seen that so much with the Planning Commission meetings necessarily, but we've definitely seen it with other meetings. And I think with the work that's been done on our housing strategies project that you're going to have a hearing on in August, they've really tried to increase their outreach to historically underrepresented groups. And so I hope that we will see a lot of participation at that hearing. You know, obviously I don't know for sure. So the strong recommendation to our administration was not to discontinue remote meetings, to find a way to do hybrid meetings. And so they are moving forward with trying to outfit the auditorium and the DSB with whatever tech is necessary to offer hybrid meetings like the board can do. And so that is going to happen. I just don't know exactly when. I heard a rumor, maybe September, but I don't want to promise. We're not really in a position at the moment to switch to the board hearing room to staff that and get that up and running right away. But that is another possibility if the Development Services Building auditorium is somewhat delayed for some reason in having the tech installed. The other thing that has happened is that the state legislature passed a bill that actually mandates that land use hearings provide an electronic option. So that bill takes effect January 1st, and it requires either that the meeting be entirely electronic or that it be hybrid. So we're really not going to have, I mean, technically your study sessions, I think, could still be in person, but that makes little sense to me that we would switch for one and not the other. So both our land use hearings with our land use hearings officers and our land use hearings in front of you and in front of the board will have to have an electronic option. And again, I said that takes effect January 1st. So that's a very long way of saying that we are not going to be changing anything for August. We will continue to be remote for both of your meetings in August. So on August 9th, you have a comprehensive plan amendment and zone change application for a site in the former city of Damascus. Melissa Ahrens and Martha Fritzie will be here to present that. And then on August 23rd, you have a public hearing on phase 1 of the Housing Strategies project that you just had your study session on 2 weeks ago. Martha Fritzie, Joy Fields, and Karen Burek will be staffing that. I'll be here on the 9th. I will not be here on the 23rd. So that's what's happening in August. We will be on Zoom. At the moment, there is nothing scheduled for September. And so unless something needs to be continued, so I can't cancel your meetings because I don't know if you're going to need to continue something, but unless one of the August items is continued, then there will be no meetings in September. There's nothing else that's ready, but it's pretty likely that there will be something in October. And so I will hope that we can have the tech ready to have you all in person, but with the remote option by October. And we will work toward that, and I will keep you informed.
Was there something scheduled for August the 2nd?
No, I had been, if we hadn't had a quorum tonight, then I wanted to know if you could be, if some of you could be available August 2nd to host this meeting, but since we managed to get it all done tonight, we're good, and you won't meet again until the 9th.
Well, I'm gonna miss all of you.
So that's all, that covered other business and schedule review. I do not have anything else.
So Jennifer, would it take a lot of time and training to use the board hearing room?
I honestly don't know, Kevin. I asked the question, and I think PGA kind of landed on the answer of we're retrofitting the DSB auditorium. So and we've already notified for August. So we definitely will not be in the board hearing room in August. I think it's possible my thinking is if we can't get the DSB ready for what I expect to be an October hearing, then I would want to evaluate. Yeah, and they were talking about actually maybe having PGA support for us for the first meeting or two because our staff's not used to running that room. So we would figure that all out.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
I'm just curious how, fortunately tonight we didn't have a lot of testimony, but I remember back when we have a room full of people and you're trying to manage the testimony, you're trying to limit the speaker, the amount of time they speak.
Right.
I'm curious, is it easier or harder with the remote to manage those types of meetings? Because the one thing that I always, when I was chair, when we'd have large meetings like that, is you had a pretty good sense because you could see the crowd. With this hybrid approach, we still won't really see the full crowd. So we really don't know, we really won't know as much about, what we're, could be deliberating on and how many people are. So it just seems like I appreciate where they're coming from. And those are all great points as to why there should be this hybrid, but they're also, for the person managing the meeting, they're going to need some help, particularly if we have a large controversial topic that could, lead to hours of testimony, which we've been through before. I've been through.
Mhm.
I'd just be curious to know how that would work, or do you have the ability in the virtual where you can just cut them off, or you can't do as easily in the live setting? I don't know.
So I think Darcy probably can speak to how our Thursday, our sort of regular hearings have been going.
Yeah,
With our hearings officer.
yeah. I'm curious.
Honestly, it is a lot easier to manage in the remote setting
Uh-huh.
because people have their hand up. They
Yeah.
they show up in order of raising their hand. So, nobody's like, oh, they got called before me, because everybody shows up in exactly the order that they raised their hand. When they're done, they're done. You don't have people jumping up and interrupting or arguing a point out of turn.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's very easy to manage. And I can see exactly how many people are in the meeting.
You can.
Oh, yeah.
What,
Yeah. But the chair.
Tom,
can't.
Tom, you can see
too.
that. Yeah.
You should be able to see it too.
So if you open your participants panel,
Participants on the bottom.
Yeah.
You can see who's all in the meeting.
You can see the names. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
yeah, you can't see the faces, but you
Yeah,
can
yeah.
see the names at least
Yeah.
under attendees.
Yeah. And I also want to point out that during roll call, I was listening, but because I was viewed as an attendee, you didn't hear me say yes.
Was that you on the phone and then you disappeared?
Yes, that was me. So I was listening to everything as I was driving up. I just want you to know, I didn't just show up I was committed, and I tried. I stopped. I almost was going to stop at Brian's house. I stopped in Boring and to say, hey, Brian, can I join you?
Right on.
But so I tried to go out. I couldn't Zoom remotely on my phone. So I just called in. And but anyway, I just want you to know I was committed.
Okay. Well, I also saw the email that you sent. So
Yeah.
I knew you were going to join us.
Yeah. Well, that's why I said it because, oops, I can't talk to you right now. It wouldn't let me let you.
You're always welcome in Damascus too, Tom.
Oh, okay. So you're in Damascus?
Yeah.
Oh, because I was debating whether I should stop at Mertz's place first. I was coming over Mount Hood.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, 3 options come through.
I had 3 options.
Well, I have definitely seen, if we anticipate that we're going, and sometimes we don't know, but if we anticipate that you're going to have a hearing that's really, controversial, and if we were remote, or even if we were hybrid, we have for our Thursday hearings, I guess just once, gotten PGA support, so that it wasn't just Darcy. We actually had somebody from PGA who moderates the town halls that the board has.
Okay.
Which adds just a little something extra in terms of virtual crowd control. So if we ever needed that, we'd be able to do that. Like if we had a surface mine, for example, where we knew there was going to be controversy, we had to, we've always had to plan extra when those are in person.
Yeah.
So
True.
we'd be able to anticipate, I think,
Okay.
some things that need. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a little harder to take the pulse of the room when the room is virtual.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's an element that's missing.
Hey, Murph, I'd like to give a shout out to you. You did a good job
Yep.
over the last couple of meetings.
Yeah.
That's because I have Brian and Kevin for crutches here. Yeah. People keep an eye on me. Yeah. And Tom. Yeah.
Well, and he's being called on once more because Tammy's not going to be here on the 9th either. And then she'll be back to take the gavel back on the 23rd. So Murph will be an expert by then.
No, but I really need the experience. That's good. Thank you. But I wanted to ask Jennifer, is there any way we can help Louise? That we get a better connection for her?
Yeah, that's true.
So important.
Well, I mean, we can't do anything about Louise's internet at her home. We are getting her the iPad back, the one that she had before, but that won't help the internet situation. It's conceivable, you know, I have to ask. I just don't know if there's a way, you know, now that we don't have the COVID protocols, potentially, you know, I could be at the office, or, you know, the planner could be at the office, and maybe then Louise would be able to actually come to the office. She'd still be on Zoom, but that may be a possibility. So I can look into that for August as an option, because at least then her connection would be reliable. So.
Yeah, because half the time she was cutting out, which was really unfortunate. She was trying to make a point and we couldn't hear what she was saying.
Right. Yeah. So we can look into that for the August meetings as a possibility. Because I think I don't know why I wouldn't be able to be in the office on the 9th if Louise, if you wanted to come in, you could Zoom from the county building. You and I would need to be in separate rooms, or we would be sort of like competing with each other probably, but I think that would be feasible. And the internet connection, I mean, no internet connection's 100%, but the one at the office is pretty darn good. So
yeah,
have low risk there.
But yeah, Murph, isn't that 5G working pretty good for you?
What's that? Repeat that?
I thought you had a 5G set up there at your place.
No, but I have maximum everything. I went through my house. I kept having disconnects, probably about 5 a day. I had a new router. I bought a state of the art, thought it was the greatest. Well, it turned out it was a router that was an issue. I went through 3 modems, all new wiring, as much speed as I could possibly buy. Finally, I ended up buying a new router, and that was it.
There you go. And that new roof will help, right?
That new roof will help. Absolutely.
You know, another option for Louise is not an ideal situation, but I think if you turned your video off, it might help your bandwidth, and we might not have audio problems with you. That makes sense.
it's true.
Well, I didn't think it was an option with the public, hearing whatever to have my video off all the time. That would be fine, but I live way out in the middle of nowhere, and I have multiple routers all over my house, and there's nothing Malala Communications can do. There's just no service here. Sometimes it's roaming, sometimes it's 1X, sometimes it's nothing, sometimes it's 4G. But it is what it is, and it's kind of like the Stone Age out here, and smoke signals work better. So I'm never going to have good internet probably out here until Malala becomes New York City, which isn't going to happen. So it's just the way it is.
You don't want to be using the smoke signals right now. Pretty dry out there, I'm sure.
Yeah, don't start talking about smoke signals with all this dry weather we're
Yeah.
All right, well, gang, we're past 10, and I need to let Darcy get some time off work today. So
All right.
we should call it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Darcy.
Yep. Thanks, Darcy.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys. We'll
everybody.
see you later.
See you
All
in a
right.
couple weeks.
Have a nice evening.
Right.